The fire had burned down to coals by the time Samuel and his bride arrived at Dutch Kellerman's cabin. Their horses stamped in the cold, breath steaming white in the December darkness. Through the small window, they could see the old man sitting in his chair, pipe smoke curling toward the rafters. "He's still awake," Samuel's bride said, pulling her shawl tighter. "Dutch doesn't sleep much anymore," Samuel replied. "Says he's got too many stories left to tell." They tied their horses and knocked. The door swung open before their knuckles left the wood. Dutch Kellerman stood in the doorway, 72 years weathered into his face like the grain in old oak. His eyes were still sharp, though, bright as a hawk's in the lamplight. "Figured you two would come tonight," he said. "Got coffee on. Come in before you freeze." The cabin was small but warm, smelling of wood smoke and tobacco and the particular scent of a man who'd spent his life working with horses. Dutch settled back into his chair, gesturing to the younger couple to take the bench by the fire. "Dutch," Samuel said once they'd gotten their coffee, "we came to ask you something." "I know what you came to ask." The old man tamped fresh tobacco into his pipe. "Your grandmother told you to come hear the real story, didn't she?" Samuel's bride leaned forward, her young face eager in the firelight. "Everyone says your grandparents had the greatest love story on the frontier, that it was practically destiny." Dutch lit his pipe, drew on it slow. "Destiny." He let the word hang there like smoke. "That's a word folks use when they don't want to talk about the choices that hurt." "I don't understand," the bride said. "You want to know how Abigail Wynne became Abigail Cutter, how a schoolteacher nobody wanted ended up married to the biggest man in 3 counties, how they went from strangers to—" He paused, eyes distant. "Well, to what they became." "Yes," Samuel said. "The real story, not the church version." Dutch settled deeper into his chair. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Snow was coming. He could feel it in his bones. "All right then," he said, "but I'm telling you true. And the truth has teeth, children. It's got blood under its fingernails. You still want to hear it?" They nodded, moving closer to the fire. Dutch drew on his pipe, let the smoke out slow. When he spoke again, his voice had changed, dropping into the cadence of a story that had waited 20 years to be told right. "It started in September of 1882, he said. "Year of the big snow, year Marcus Blackwood decided to collect on a 20-year-old debt. And it started with a woman at a chalkboard who'd made peace with being alone. Miss Abigail Wynne stood at the front of Red Fern Ridge's one-room schoolhouse, watching Tommy Fletcher's face scrunch up with concentration. The boy's tongue poked out slightly as he worked through 7 times 8, his slate pencil making scratching sounds in the afternoon quiet. September light came through the windows in dusty columns, the kind of light that made you think of harvest and ending things. Outside, the Wyoming prairie stretched away to forever, rolling hills covered in buffalo grass, gone gold with the season. 56, Miss Wynne, Tommy said finally. Very good. Abigail smiled at him, the expression lighting up features that, while not beautiful by conventional measure, held a warmth that made people want to stay in her presence. You're getting faster with your multiplication. The boy beamed. Around him, 19 other students bent over their own work. Abigail moved between the desks, helping where needed, correcting gently, praising freely. This was what she was good at. This was where she belonged. She'd been teaching in Red Fern Ridge for 8 years now. 8 years of rise before dawn, walk the quarter-mile from her cottage to this schoolhouse, tend the pot-bellied stove, teach children whose parents had barely learned to read themselves. 8 years of going home to silence. At 33, she'd made her peace with it, or told herself she had. The door creaked open. Abigail looked up, expecting a parent come early to collect a child. Instead, a stranger stood in the doorway, hat in his hands, dust on his boots. He was perhaps 40, lean and weathered, with eyes that moved too quick across the room. Something about him made Abigail's shoulders tighten. "Ma'am," he said, voice carrying an accent from somewhere south. "Sorry to interrupt your teaching. I'm looking for work. Heard the Cutter Ranch might be hiring hands." The children had gone quiet, watching. Abigail moved toward the door, putting herself between the stranger and her students. "Mr. Cutter doesn't usually hire this time of year," she said, keeping her voice level. "Harvest is done. Most ranchers are letting hands go, not taking them on." "That so?" The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Shame. I heard he's got that big north pasture. Thought a spread that size would always need good men." There was something in the way he said north pasture that made the back of Abigail's neck prickle. Too specific, too interested. "You might try in town," she said. "At the Mercantile. They keep a list of who's hiring." "Appreciate that, ma'am." He put his hat back on, but his eyes lingered on her face just a moment too long. "You teach all these children yourself?" "I do." "That's real admirable. Woman alone, doing such important work." He touched his hat brim. "You tell anyone who's asking name's Reeves, I'll be around town a few days." He left, but Abigail stood at the door watching him ride away. He didn't head toward town. He rode west, toward the Blackwood ranch. "Miss Wynne?" Sarah Mitchell's voice pulled her back. "Are you all right?" Abigail turned to find her brightest student watching her with those too observant 12-year-old eyes. "I'm fine, Sarah, just thinking." She forced a smile. "Let's get back to our lessons, shall we?" But the unease stayed with her the rest of the afternoon. Dutch paused in his telling, refilling his pipe. Samuel and his bride waited, caught in the story's grip. "That stranger," Samuel said. "Did he—" "Patience," Dutch said. "You'll get your answers. But stories don't work if you rush them. They need to breathe." He lit his pipe again. "Where was I? Oh, yes. Abigail walking home that evening." The walk from the schoolhouse to her cottage took 15 minutes across open prairie. Usually Abigail enjoyed it. The vastness of the sky, the wind in the grass, the sense of being small in a big world. Tonight, though, she found herself looking over her shoulder. The stranger's visit had unsettled her more than it should have. Men drifted through Red Fern Ridge all the time, looking for work or running from something. Usually she barely noticed them. But something about this one stuck in her mind. The way he'd known about the north pasture, the way he'd looked at her like he was memorizing her face. She was being foolish, probably. Her cottage came into view, small and neat, with its kitchen garden gone to seed for the winter. 8 years she'd lived here. 8 years of making this little house into something that felt like home, even if it was only her inside it. She was reaching for her door when movement caught her eye. Down the road, near where it forked toward the bigger ranches, 2 men sat on horseback in conversation. One was the stranger, Reeves. The other was Marcus Blackwood. Abigail froze. Even from this distance, she recognized Blackwood's fine black horse, his expensive hat. He was the only rancher in 3 counties who dressed like he was going to church even when he was checking fence lines. As she watched, Blackwood gestured toward the north, toward Cutterland. Reeves nodded, said something she couldn't hear. Then Blackwood looked her way. She didn't think he could see her clearly at this distance, but he raised his hand anyway. A small wave. Like he knew exactly where she was. Abigail went inside quickly and locked the door. She stood in her small parlor, heart beating too fast, telling herself she was being ridiculous, but her hands shook as she lit the lamp. That night, she barely slept. The next morning brought no answers, only the familiar rhythm of teaching. Abigail threw herself into lessons, trying to forget the stranger and his conversation with Marcus Blackwood. She was helping Emma Cole with her reading when hoofbeats sounded outside. Heavy hoofbeats, the kind a very large horse makes. The children looked up, curious. Abigail glanced through the window and felt her breath catch. A man was dismounting from a bay gelding so massive it made regular horses look like ponies. The man himself was even more imposing, easily 6.5 feet tall, with shoulders that seemed to fill the whole doorway before he even reached it. Boaz Cutter. Abigail had seen him before, of course. Red Fern Ridge was small enough that everyone knew everyone by sight, but she'd never been this close to him. Never had him seek her out specifically. He climbed the steps to the schoolhouse, each boot strike solid and deliberate. Then he knocked. Actually knocked, despite the door being open. Polite. "Miss Wynne," his voice was deep, rumbling like distant thunder. Might I have a word with you?" Every child in the room had gone silent. You could have heard a pin drop on the wooden floor. Abigail's mouth had gone dry. "Of course, Mr. Cutter. Children, please continue with your work quietly. I'll be just outside." She stepped onto the porch, very aware of how small she felt next to this man. At 5'4", she was average height for a woman, but Boaz Cutter made her feel positively tiny. He stood with his hat in his hands, turning it slowly. Up close, she could see he was perhaps 38, with dark hair shot through with premature silver at the temples. His face was weathered from years of sun and wind, but his eyes were gentle, deep brown, like good soil. "Miss Wynne," he said again, then stopped, seemed to gather himself. "I reckon you might think this strange, me coming here like this." "I'm listening," she managed. He looked at her directly then. No looking away, no pretense, just honest assessment, like he was judging the worth of a horse, but somehow making it feel respectful. "How long you been teaching here?" he asked. The question surprised her. 8 years this September." He nodded slowly. "That's long enough to know this territory. Long enough to know what winter does to folks who face it alone." Abigail felt her spine stiffen. "I've managed just fine." "I'm sure you have." No condescension in his tone, just fact. "Question is, do you want to keep managing, or do you want to live?" The question hung between them like the dust motes in the September sun. Abigail stared at him, trying to understand where this was going. "I don't understand what you're asking, Mr. Cutter." He shifted his weight, and she noticed he was nervous. This giant of a man was actually nervous talking to her. "I'm asking if you'd consider a partnership," he said carefully. "Legal marriage, separate quarters, respect on both sides." He paused. "I need someone who won't run when things get hard. You need security that teaching alone can't provide." Abigail's mind had gone blank. "Marriage?" He was proposing marriage? "I'm not offering romance, Miss Wynne," he continued, as if reading her shock. "I'm offering survival with dignity, a practical arrangement between two adults who understand how hard this country is." She had to stop, collect herself. "Mr. Cutter, I barely know you." "True enough. But you know I'm honest. You know I work hard and pay my debts. You know I've never been married, never had children. And you know this ranch could provide for you better than teaching school ever will." He said it all calmly, reasonably, like he was discussing the weather, but there was something in his eyes. Not desperation exactly, but loneliness that recognized itself in another person. "I don't understand why you've come to me," she said finally. "Because I don't want a girl," he replied, and for the first time there was real feeling in his voice. "I don't want someone who sees me and thinks project or ticket to comfort. I want a woman who knows her own mind, who's faced life and not run from it." He gestured toward the schoolhouse. "You've been doing that for 8 years, teaching frontier children, making something matter out here in the middle of nowhere. That tells me what I need to know about your character." Abigail felt something shift in her chest. When had anyone last spoken to her as if she were valuable, as if she were more than just poor Miss Wynne who couldn't catch a husband? "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Cutter?" "Marriage," he said simply. "A partnership. I won't lie to you and say it's about love. I don't know much about that particular sentiment, but I know about respect, and I know about taking care of what's mine. You'd have a good home, security, position as my wife." He paused. "And in time, if we're fortunate, perhaps children. But I'm not asking you to love me, Miss Wynne. I'm asking you to stand beside me." The honesty of it was breathtaking. No flowery promises, no false romance, just a practical arrangement between two people who understood the frontier's harsh realities. "I would need time to consider," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Of course." He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a folded paper. "I had my lawyer draw this up. Terms of the arrangement. What I'm offering, what I'd expect. Read it over. Think about it." He handed it to her. "But don't take too long, Miss Wynne. Winter's coming whether we're ready or not, and some decisions get harder the longer you wait to make them." He put his hat back on, touched the brim in farewell. "I'll be at the ranch if you have questions, or if you've made a decision." Then he was walking back to that massive horse, mounting with fluid grace, riding away across the prairie. Abigail stood on the porch, holding the paper, watching him disappear into the vastness of the landscape. Her hands were shaking. Behind her, through the window, she could hear the children whispering. She'd have to go back inside, face their questions. But for a moment she just stood there, feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her feet. Dutch stopped talking, sipped his coffee. It had gone cold. "What did the contract say?" Samuel's bride asked. Dutch smiled. "Patience, child. I'm getting there." That evening, Abigail sat at her small kitchen table, the contract spread before her like a map to a foreign country. The lamplight flickered across words that would change her life. The document was handwritten in careful, educated script. That surprised her. She'd expected something crude, befitting a rough rancher. But the penmanship was thoughtful, measured. Marriage contract of practical arrangement between Boaz Cutter and Abigail Wynne, entered into for mutual benefit and protection, with the understanding that affection may grow, but is not required for the fulfillment of the terms herein. She read through each clause carefully, her teacher's mind automatically noting structure and intention. Mrs. Wynne shall maintain her position as schoolteacher for so long as she desires and is able. Mrs. Wynne shall have her own household allowance, separate from ranch accounts, for her personal use. Mrs. Wynne shall maintain separate quarters initially, with the understanding that this arrangement may change by mutual agreement. Mrs. Wynne shall be treated with respect in all matters, public and private. In return, Mrs. Wynne shall manage household affairs, and in time, God willing, bear children to ensure the continuation of the Cutter name and ranch. It was fair, more than fair. He was offering her everything she'd thought she'd lost when Henry Morrison broke their engagement 8 years ago: security, position, purpose. But there was a knock at her door before she could think further. Mrs. Henderson from the Mercantile stood on her step, round face flushed with either cold or excitement. "Abigail, dear," she said, not waiting for invitation before bustling inside, "I heard the most extraordinary thing at the store today. Is it true that Boaz Cutter came to see you at the school?" Word traveled fast in a town of 300 souls. "Mr. Cutter did stop by, yes," Abigail said carefully. "And?" Mrs. Henderson's eyes were bright with curiosity. What did he want? There was no point in hiding it. The whole town would know by tomorrow anyway. Small towns had their own mysterious ways of spreading information. "He asked me to marry him," Abigail said simply. Mrs. Henderson's teacup clattered against its saucer. "Marry him? Boaz Cutter? But he's never shown interest in any woman, not in all the years he's been here. And you've never, you two barely know each other." "That's what I told him. He said it was a practical arrangement. He needs a wife, and I need—" She paused, the words sticking in her throat. "Security." The older woman's expression shifted from shock to something like pity. "Oh, Abigail, I know the winters are hard on you, living alone out here. But marriage to a man you don't love, marriage to a stranger, really, are you sure this is wise?" "I don't know," Abigail admitted. "I haven't decided yet." Mrs. Henderson sat down her tea entirely, leaning forward with concern. "He's so imposing. All those stories about his strength, his temper when crossed. Aren't you afraid?" Abigail thought about that. She had been aware of Boaz Cutter's reputation, the stories of his physical prowess, his success with the ranch, the way other men deferred to him. But in their brief conversation, she'd seen something else beneath that intimidating exterior. "He was gentle with me," she said finally, "respectful, honest about what he could offer and what he expected in return. There are worse things than marrying a good man who deals fairly." Mrs. Henderson shook her head. "The whole town will be talking about this. Some will say you're being practical. But others—" She left the sentence hanging. "Others will say I'm desperate," Abigail finished. "Perhaps they're right, but perhaps being desperate isn't always a bad thing if it leads you to make a necessary change." After Mrs. Henderson left, Still shaking her head and muttering about modern women and their strange choices, Abigail returned to the contract. She read it through 3 more times, considering each clause, each implication. The marriage would take place within 2 weeks if she agreed. She would move to his ranch but could maintain the schoolhouse as long as she wished. He would provide for her material needs and protect her as his wife. In return, she would manage his household and, in time, hopefully bear his children. It was all so practical, so bloodless, nothing like the romantic dreams she'd carried as a young woman in Ohio, before Henry Morrison taught her that love was a luxury not everyone could afford. She was reaching for a pen when another knock sounded at her door. This time it was Dr. Morrison, the town's physician, carrying his black bag and an expression of concern. "Miss Wynne," he said, "forgive the late call, but I heard about Boaz Cutter's proposal, and I wanted to offer my perspective, if you'll have it." Abigail let him in, made fresh tea. Dr. Morrison was perhaps 55, a widower himself, with kind eyes and the careful manner of a man who'd seen much suffering. "What do you know of Mr. Cutter?" Abigail asked once they were seated. "I've been his physician for 15 years, Dr. Morrison said, since he returned from the war. He's a good man, Abigail, a troubled one perhaps, but good at his core." "Troubled how?" The doctor chose his words carefully. "He's known loss. His mother died when he was young. His father—" he paused. "His father died 20 years ago, found in the North Pasture. Heart attack, the sheriff ruled, though Boaz was only 17 at the time. Had to run that ranch all by himself, grieving, barely more than a boy." Abigail felt her throat tighten. "That's terrible. It shaped him," Dr. Morrison continued. "Made him hard on the outside. But I've seen him with injured animals, with sick hands. He's got gentle hands, Abigail. My late wife used to say that gentle hands mean a gentle heart." He sipped his tea, then added, "I won't tell you what to do. That's not my place. But if you're worried about him being cruel or unkind, I don't believe that's in his nature." After the doctor left, Abigail stood at her window, watching the sun set over the prairie. The sky was on fire with orange and gold, the kind of sunset that made you believe in beauty even in harsh places. She thought about the life she'd built here, the careful routines that had sustained her through 8 years of solitude, teaching children, walking to school and back, reading alone by lamplight, Sunday services where she sat with other unmarried women, all of them trying to pretend they didn't notice the pity in married women's eyes. It was a good life, respectable, useful. But Dr. Morrison's wife had been right about one thing: gentle hands meant a gentle heart. And in that brief conversation, Boaz Cutter had treated her with more genuine respect than Henry Morrison had shown in 2 years of courtship. She retrieved the contract one final time. At the bottom, a space for her signature. "Abigail Wynne," she wrote carefully. Then, beneath it, as if trying on the shape of it, "soon to become Abigail Cutter." The act felt both momentous and surprisingly simple, like stepping across a threshold into a room she'd never seen, but somehow always knew was waiting for her. The next day brought more visitors than Abigail had seen in months. By noon it seemed half the town had found reasons to stop by the schoolhouse or her cottage. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, came with thinly veiled concern. "I think it's romantic," she declared, though her tone suggested otherwise. "Like something from a storybook. The mysterious rancher and the schoolteacher." "I think it's scandalous," countered Mrs. Hartwell, the preacher's wife. "Marriage should be based on love and Christian devotion, not mere convenience." Reverend Matthews himself stopped by during the afternoon recess. He was a practical man for a preacher, weathered by frontier life into someone who understood that God's will sometimes looked different out here than it did in established places. "Boaz Cutter is a good man, if a solitary one," he said, watching the children play in the schoolyard. "He's honest, hard-working, prosperous. You could do worse, Miss Wynne, though I confess I'd hoped for a more traditional courtship for you." "I'm 33, Reverend," Abigail replied quietly. "Traditional courtship isn't exactly beating down my door." He had the grace to look embarrassed. "Forgive me." "That was thoughtless." He paused. "Have you signed the contract?" "I have." "Then I'll prepare for the ceremony. Unless you'd like time for a more elaborate wedding?" Abigail shook her head. "No, if I'm doing this, I'd rather do it simply." But it was young Sarah Mitchell who provided the most compelling argument. When she walked the girl home after school, Sarah looked up at her with those serious blue eyes and asked, "Miss Wynne, are you really going to marry Mr. Cutter?" "I'm thinking about it very seriously, Sarah." "Why?" "Because he fixed our fence when Papa hurt his back, and he didn't ask for nothing in return, and he let me pet his horse once when I was scared of it." Sarah considered. "His hands are real big, but he was gentle with the horse. Mama says gentle hands mean a gentle heart." The same words Dr. Morrison's wife had said. Abigail felt something tighten in her chest. "Your mama sounds very wise," she managed. That evening, as the sun painted the prairie in shades of amber and rose, Abigail made her way across the open grassland toward the Cutter ranch. The signed contract was folded carefully in her reticule, and her teaching slate was tucked under her arm, a familiar talisman from her old life as she stepped toward her new one. The ranch house sat in a natural depression between two low hills, protected from the worst prairie winds but positioned to catch the morning sun. It was larger than she'd expected, a solid log structure with a wide front porch and several outbuildings that spoke of prosperity and careful planning. As she approached, she could see Boaz working near the corral, his massive frame unmistakable even at a distance. He was mending a bridle, his large hands working the leather with surprising delicacy. He looked up as she drew near, setting aside his work and walking toward her with that easy, ground-covering stride. He was bareheaded in the afternoon sun, his dark hair catching glints of silver, and there was something in his expression, a mixture of hope and uncertainty, that made her realize this arrangement mattered to him more than his practical words had suggested. "Miss Wynne," he said, touching his hat brim in greeting, "I wasn't expecting you so early." "I wanted to speak with you before the school day tomorrow," she replied, suddenly feeling the weight of what she was about to do. "I've made my decision." His eyes dropped to her reticule, and she saw his jaw tighten slightly. Whether from anticipation or anxiety, she couldn't tell. Instead of answering with words, she drew out the folded contract and handed it to him. His hands, those gentle hands everyone spoke of, took the paper carefully, as if it were something precious. She watched as his eyes scanned the document, pausing at her signature at the bottom. When he looked up again, something had changed in his expression, a softening, as if a tension he'd been carrying for days had finally released. "You're certain about this?" he asked quietly. "As certain as anyone can be about the unknown," she replied. "I have conditions, though." "I expected you would." "What are they?" She'd rehearsed this conversation during the walk to his ranch, but now, standing before this imposing man who would soon be her husband, the words felt awkward on her tongue. "I want to continue teaching, at least for now. The children depend on me, and I need to know that I can still be useful in that way." "Agreed," he said without hesitation. "What else?" "Separate bedrooms initially. I know that may seem sensible," he interrupted gently. "We're strangers entering a practical arrangement. There's no rush to complicate things beyond what they already are." His easy acceptance of her terms surprised her. She'd expected some resistance, some assertion of husbandly rights. Instead, he was treating her conditions with the same practical consideration he'd shown throughout their brief acquaintance. "Is there anything else?" he asked. She looked down at the teaching slate in her hands, its smooth surface worn from years of lessons and demonstrations. "I want your word that you'll respect the person I am now, not try to change me into someone you think a wife should be." Boaz was quiet for a long moment, his eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her feel exposed, vulnerable. When he finally spoke, his voice was softer than she'd ever heard it. "Abigail," he said, and the sound of her given name in his deep voice sent an unexpected shiver through her. "I asked you to marry me because of who you are, not to spite it. I don't want a different woman. I want you." The simple honesty of the statement hit her like a physical blow. When had anyone last wanted her? Specifically, particularly, for herself, rather than for what she could provide or represent. 2 weeks, he continued, his voice returning to its practical tone. Will that give you enough time to make arrangements with the school board about continuing your teaching? Yes, she managed, though her voice came out slightly breathless. Yes, I think so. Good. I'll speak with Reverend Matthews about the ceremony. Nothing fancy. Just the legal requirements and a few witnesses. She nodded, then found herself hesitating. There was so much they hadn't discussed, so many practical details that would need to be worked out. Boaz, she said, testing his name on her tongue and finding it fit better than she'd expected. What do you expect from me day to day? I mean, I've lived alone for 8 years. I don't know how to be a wife. A ghost of a smile touched the corners of his mouth. I don't know how to be a husband either, Abigail. I figure we'll learn together. The simplicity of it was both reassuring and daunting. No grand romantic gestures, no passionate declarations. Just 2 people agreeing to figure out life together as they went along. But before she could respond, the sound of hoofbeats made them both turn. A rider was approaching from the direction of town, not unusual on a ranch, but something in Boaz's sudden tension told her this visitor wasn't welcome. The man who rode into the yard was handsome in a studied way, perhaps 45, dressed too well for casual ranch visiting. He sat his expensive black horse like he owned the world, and his smile when he saw Abigail and Boaz standing together was both charming and somehow predatory. "Cutter," the man said, tipping his hat. "Miss Wynne, what a pleasant surprise to find you both here." "Blackwood," Boaz replied, his voice gone carefully neutral. "What brings you by?" "Marcus Blackwood." Abigail felt her stomach tighten. The man who'd been talking to the stranger yesterday. The man who'd waved at her like he knew exactly where she was. "Just being neighborly," Blackwood said easily. "Heard some interesting news in town today? About a wedding?" His eyes moved between them, assessing. "Congratulations are in order, I suppose." "Thank you," Boaz said, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. But Blackwood wasn't finished. "It's remarkable, really, you being a solitary man for so long, Cutter, and Miss Wynne so dedicated to her teaching. I wonder what brought about such a sudden change of heart." There was something in his tone, mockery barely concealed, that made Abigail's spine stiffen. "Sometimes people recognize good sense when they see it, Mr. Blackwood," she said, before Boaz could respond. "Not everything requires a grand romance to be worthwhile." Blackwood's smile widened. "Well said, Miss Wynne. Practical. I admire that." He looked at Boaz again. "Though I hope marriage won't distract you from ranch business. These are uncertain times. A man needs to keep his eyes on his holdings, especially prime holdings like that North Pasture of yours." Abigail felt Boaz go rigid beside her. "The North Pasture isn't for sale," Boaz said flatly. "Never has been, never will be." "Oh, I'm not suggesting it is," Blackwood replied smoothly. "Just making conversation. That's fine grazing land. Valuable. A man would be wise to protect such assets, especially now that he has a wife to think about." He tipped his hat to Abigail. "Ma'am, beautiful women civilize rough men. We'll see if it takes." He wheeled his horse around and rode away, leaving a wake of unease behind him. Abigail watched him go, her earlier encounter with the stranger replaying in her mind. "That man who came to the school yesterday," she said quietly, "looking for work. I saw him talking to Blackwood afterward." Boaz's expression had gone dark. "What did he look like?" She described Reeves' lean, weathered, southern accent, too interested in the North Pasture. "Damn," Boaz said softly, then catching himself, "Forgive my language." "What is it?" He looked at her, seemed to make a decision. "That man has always circled this ranch like a vulture, ever since my father died. And now—" He stopped himself. "And now what?" "Nothing. Old history." But his hand had gone to his vest pocket, touching something there. The gesture was unconscious, protective. "Boaz," Abigail said carefully, "what happened to your father?" For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he said very quietly, "He died in the North Pasture 20 years ago. They said it was his heart. He was only 42. The pain in his voice was raw, despite 2 decades of distance. Abigail found herself reaching out, touching his arm. The gesture surprised them both. "I'm sorry," she said. He looked down at her hand on his arm, then back at her face. "Thank you for signing the contract, Abigail, and not just for the practical reasons. For," he seemed to struggle for words, "for choosing to stand with me." "We stand together," she said, surprising herself with the conviction in her voice. "That's what partnership means." Dutch stopped talking, stretched his old bones. The fire had burned down to glowing coals, painting the cabin in shades of red and shadow. "And that's how it started," he said. "2 lonely people making a practical choice, not knowing that choice would pull them into something that had been festering for 20 years. "The stranger," Samuel said. "Was he working for Blackwood?" "Oh, yes, but that's getting ahead of the story." Dutch stood, moved to add wood to the fire. "You want to hear the rest? You'll need to come back tomorrow night. I'm an old man. I need my sleep." Samuel's bride looked disappointed, but she stood too, pulling her shawl back on. "Tomorrow then," Samuel said. "But Dutch, did they love each other? Eventually?" The old cowboy smiled, his weathered face creasing into 1,000 lines. "Child, what do you think love is? Lightning that strikes and transforms? Maybe for some, but for your grandparents." He paused, choosing his words with care. Love was rain, slow, steady, soaking deep. And when it grew something, that something lasted. He walked them to the door, watched them mount their horses. "Tomorrow night," he called after them. "And I'll tell you about the wedding, about the quiet ways they learned each other, and about the night everything changed." They rode away into the darkness, and Dutch closed his door against the cold. But before he banked the fire for the night, he pulled something from his pocket, an old pocket watch, silver worn smooth from years of handling. He opened it. Inside was a faded photograph of a young man and woman standing stiff and formal in wedding clothes. The woman's eyes were kind. The man's face was weathered even in youth. "Got them asking the right questions now," Dutch said softly to the photograph. "Tomorrow I'll tell them about the war, about the nightmares, about the day she found the deed and everything came to light." He closed the watch gently, set it on the mantel. Outside, the first snow of winter had begun to fall, covering the prairie in white, covering the old blood and the old sorrows, the way time always did. But some stories deserved to be told. Some truths needed to survive the snow. Dutch settled into his chair, pulled a blanket over his knees, and watched the fire burn down to embers. Tomorrow he'd tell them more. Tomorrow he'd tell them about the choices that changed everything. But tonight, he let them sit with the beginning. The moment when Abigail Wynne became Abigail Cutter, not knowing that her practical arrangement would become the greatest fight and the greatest love of her life. The next evening, Samuel and his bride returned to Dutch's cabin just as the sun was setting over the prairie. The old cowboy was already waiting, fire built up high, coffee pot steaming on the stove. "Punctual," Dutch said approvingly as he let them in. "That's good. Stories don't like to be kept waiting." They settled into their places, Samuel and his bride on the bench, Dutch in his worn chair that had molded itself to his shape over the years. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the shutters. More snow coming. "You left us at the proposal," Samuel's bride said, eager as a child at story time. "What happened next?" Dutch filled his pipe, took his time lighting it. "What happened next was 2 weeks of the whole town losing its mind," he said. Red Fern Ridge hadn't seen this much excitement since the church roof blew off in the storm of '79. He drew on his pipe, let the smoke out slow. "See, folks didn't know what to make of it. Boaz Cutter, the biggest man in 3 counties, barely said 2 words to anyone unless it was about cattle or weather, and here he was marrying a woman he'd known for all of one conversation. The gossip mill ran day and night. "What did people say?" the bride asked. "Everything you'd expect. Some said Abigail was desperate. Some said Boaz was crazy. Some said it was the most romantic thing they'd ever heard. Most just couldn't figure out why two perfectly sensible people would do something so impractical as a practical marriage." Dutch smiled at his own joke. "But I knew Boaz better than most. I'd worked for his father since before he was born, held him when he was a baby, taught him to ride when he was 6, and I knew something nobody else in town seemed to understand." "What was that?" Samuel asked. That man had been lonely so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to want company. Until Abigail. Dutch settled deeper into his chair. "Now, where was I? Oh, yes. The 2 weeks before the wedding. Abigail had expected the waiting period to be awkward. What she hadn't expected was how quickly it became something else entirely. The day after she signed the contract, she found a package on her schoolhouse steps. Inside was a beautiful leather-bound journal, the kind she'd admired in the mercantile window but could never justify buying on a teacher's salary. Tucked inside the front cover was a note in that same careful handwriting from the contract. "For lesson plans and thoughts. Every teacher needs good paper. B." She pressed her fingers to the smooth leather, something warm unfurling in her chest. That afternoon, when she walked home from school, she found Boaz repairing the fence around her cottage garden. He looked up as she approached, and for a moment they just stood there, both uncertain. "The posts were rotting," he said finally. "Thought I'd fix them before. Thank you," she managed. "For the journal, too." A faint color rose in his weathered cheeks. "Saw you looking at it last month. In town." He'd noticed. He'd remembered. The thought made her throat tight. "Would you—" she hesitated. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" It was the first time she'd invited him into her space. He seemed to understand the significance of it because he wiped his hands carefully on his trousers before following her inside. Her cottage was small, a parlor, a kitchen, a bedroom barely large enough for her narrow bed. But she'd made it comfortable over the years, filling it with books and the small treasures a teacher accumulates. Pressed flowers from students, a quilt her mother had sent from Ohio, watercolors she'd painted on lonely Sundays. Boaz stood in the doorway of her parlor, looking around with the careful attention he gave everything. His size made the small room feel even smaller, but somehow not oppressively so. "You've made it nice," he said. "Feels like a person lives here, not just exists." The distinction moved her. "Thank you." They sat at her small kitchen table drinking coffee, and for the first time since his proposal, they talked about ordinary things. Not marriage or contracts or practical arrangements, but just life. He asked about her students. She asked about his horses. They discovered they both hated turnips and loved thunderstorms, that they both read late into the night and woke early from habit. "I've always been an early riser," Boaz said, "even as a boy. My mother used to say I was trying to get a head start on the sun." It was the first time he'd mentioned his mother. Abigail seized the opening carefully. What was she like? His expression softened. "Kind. Educated. She taught school before she married my father. That's where I learned to love books." He paused. "She died when I was 12. Fever. It was hard. I'm sorry. Long time ago now." But his hand had gone to his vest pocket again, that unconscious gesture. "She left me her books and her watch. I carry it every day. May I see it?" He hesitated, then drew out a silver pocket watch, worn smooth from years of handling. When he opened it, she saw an old photograph inside. A young woman with kind eyes, standing next to a weathered man. "Your parents?" "Yes. Taken just before she got sick." He traced the edge of the photograph with one large finger. "Sometimes I open this and try to remember what her voice sounded like, but it gets harder every year." The vulnerability in his admission caught her off guard. This wasn't the imposing rancher everyone in town whispered about. This was a man who still missed his mother 26 years after her death. "I think," Abigail said carefully, "I think she'd be proud of the man you became." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and something passed between them. Not love, not yet, but recognition. Two people who'd both known loss and loneliness, finding unexpected comfort in each other's company. The coffee grew cold as they talked. Outside, the afternoon faded to evening, and when Boaz finally rose to leave, he paused at her door. "Abigail," he said, "I want you to know, whatever happens, whatever this becomes, I'm glad it's you." After he left, she stood at her window watching him ride away across the prairie. The sun was setting, painting everything in shades of gold and amber. And for the first time in 8 years, the silence in her cottage didn't feel quite so heavy. The wedding took place on a crisp October morning, just 2 weeks after Boaz's proposal. The leaves had turned, and the air carried that peculiar clarity that comes before the first snow. Abigail dressed in her best wool dress, a deep blue that brought out her eyes. Not a wedding dress, but then this wasn't that kind of wedding. Mrs. Patterson had offered to lend her a veil, but Abigail had declined. This was a practical arrangement. Better to be honest about it. Still, when she looked in the mirror that morning, her reflection surprised her. There was color in her cheeks, a brightness in her eyes that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. She looked like a woman about to start something, not end something. The ceremony was at Reverend Matthew's small church with only a handful of witnesses. Dutch was there. She'd learned he'd been with the Cutter family for 45 years. Dr. Morrison, Mrs. Henderson and her husband. Sarah Mitchell, who'd begged to attend, sitting wide-eyed in the front pew, and Boaz, waiting at the altar in a suit that looked uncomfortable on his large frame. But his face, when he saw her walk down the aisle, there was something in it that made her breath catch. Not passion exactly, but a kind of quiet wonder, as if he couldn't quite believe she'd actually come. Reverend Matthews kept the service simple. The traditional vows about sickness and health, richer and poorer. They made no mention of love or cherishing, just the practical promises to care for each other. It was exactly what they'd agreed upon. Yet when Boaz slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, his mother's ring, Dutch would tell her later, his hands were gentle. And when the Reverend said, "You may kiss your bride," Boaz didn't kiss her lips. Instead, he lifted her hand to his mouth and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture so unexpectedly tender that tears pricked her eyes. Then it was over, and she was Mrs. Cutter, bound to a man she'd known for less than a month. Dutch paused in his telling, refilled his pipe. Samuel and his bride were leaning forward, caught in the story. "That's when the real work began," Dutch said. "Anyone can stand up in a church and make promises. Living them is the hard part." "Were they happy?" the bride asked. Dutch considered the question. Happy isn't the right word. Not yet. They were trying, learning, figuring out how to be two people in one space. The ride from the church to the ranch was quiet. Abigail sat beside Boaz in the wagon, hyper-aware of his presence. He was her husband now. She was his wife. The words felt strange in her mind, like a language she was just beginning to learn. As they approached the ranch house, she saw it differently than before, not as a place she was visiting, but as home, her home. Boaz must have sensed her nervousness because he said quietly, "I've prepared a room for you, upstairs, facing east, like you wanted, for the morning light." True to his word, when he showed her to her room, she found it flooded with afternoon sun. He'd placed a writing desk by the window and arranged the few belongings she'd brought on the dresser with touching care. "I thought you might like space for your school preparations," he said, indicating the desk. "And there's a lamp with good light for reading." The thoughtfulness of it surprised her. This wasn't a man going through the motions of obligation. This was someone who'd given serious thought to her comfort and needs. "Thank you," she said. "It's perfect." He nodded, seemed about to leave, then stopped. "Abigail, I know this is strange. Living with someone you barely know. If you need anything at all, you just have to ask." "The same goes for you," she replied. That first evening, as husband and wife, They shared a meal he'd prepared, beef stew and fresh bread that was surprisingly good. The conversation was stilted at first, both of them feeling their way toward some kind of comfortable interaction. "Tell me about your students," he said as they ate, "the ones who give you the most trouble." She found herself relaxing as she talked about Tommy Fletcher's struggles with arithmetic, Sarah Mitchell's exceptional abilities, the challenges of teaching children with such wide age ranges and varying levels of preparation. He listened with genuine interest, asking thoughtful questions, and when she turned the questions back to him, asking about the ranch, he opened up in ways she hadn't expected. "The hardest part isn't the work," he said. "It's the decisions. Knowing when to sell cattle and when to hold them, whether to plant more hay or trust the natural graze. Every choice affects everything else. It's like," he searched for the words, "like being responsible for a small country where everything depends on you reading the weather right." "That sounds lonely," she said. He looked at her, surprised. "I suppose it was, I mean." He stopped, started again. "I'm hoping it will be different now." That night, as Abigail prepared for bed in her new room, she found another small surprise. A vase of prairie wildflowers on her nightstand, the same purple asters and black-eyed Susans he'd given her on their wedding day. He must have picked them that morning. She touched the petals gently, feeling something shift in her chest. This practical arrangement was already becoming complicated in ways she hadn't anticipated. The first week of marriage passed in a blur of adjustment. Abigail continued teaching, walking to the schoolhouse each morning and returning in the afternoon to find Boaz somewhere on the property, always working. They established routines, coffee together at dawn, dinner in the evening, an hour or two in the parlor before bed, usually reading in companionable silence. It was during one of these quiet evenings that she discovered the full extent of his library. The bookshelf in the parlor held volumes she'd only dreamed of owning, complete works of Shakespeare, Dickens, Emerson, poetry by Tennyson and Whitman. "You have incredible taste in literature," she said, pulling out a worn copy of Tennyson's poems. "My mother's influence," he replied, looking up from the ranch accounts he was reviewing. "She believed education was the most important thing she could give me, even more important than the land." Abigail opened the Tennyson to Ulysses, one of her favorites. The pages fell open to a passage that had been underlined. "Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world." "You marked this," she said, "years ago, when I was trying to decide whether to stay on the ranch or go somewhere new, somewhere I wasn't the son of a dead man trying to fill boots that seemed too big." She looked at him in surprise. He'd never spoken about his father's death beyond that brief mention. "What made you stay?" she asked carefully. His expression darkened. A promise, and maybe cowardice. Sometimes I'm not sure which. Before she could ask what he meant, he stood abruptly. "I should check on the horses. There's a mare due to foal any day now." He left her alone with the poetry, but she sat there for a long time, holding the book, trying to understand the man she'd married. Dutch stirred the fire, sent sparks spiraling up toward the cabin's rafters. "That's when I started to see it," he said. "The way they were circling each other. Careful. Both of them carrying old wounds they didn't know how to show." "But Boaz told her about his father, didn't he?" Samuel asked. "Eventually. But first," Dutch's expression grew somber. "First, she had to see what the war had done to him, and that came sooner than either of them expected." It happened 3 weeks into their marriage. Abigail woke in the deep night to the sound of screaming. At first she thought she was dreaming, but then it came again, a man's voice, raw with terror, crying out words she couldn't understand. "Boaz!" She threw on her robe and ran down the hall to his room. The door was closed, but through it she could hear him, not just screaming now, but pleading. No, please, I'm sorry, tell your mother, tell her." Abigail's hand froze on the doorknob. This was his private space. They'd agreed on separate rooms, on respecting boundaries. But that sound, it was the sound of a soul in agony. She opened the door. The room was dark except for moonlight through the window. Boaz was sitting up in bed, sheets tangled around him, his large frame shaking. His eyes were open but unseeing, locked on some horror only he could perceive. "Boaz," she said softly. He didn't hear her. "So young," he was saying. "God, he was so young. I didn't mean to—" She moved closer carefully. "Boaz, you're dreaming. Wake up." His head whipped toward her, and for a moment she thought he didn't recognize her. His eyes were wild, his face slick with sweat. Then awareness crashed back, and he gasped, pressing his hands to his face. "Abigail!" His voice was wrecked. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you." "Don't apologize." She sat on the edge of his bed, keeping a careful distance. "You were having a nightmare." "It's always the same one." He was still trembling. I'd hoped they'd stopped." "How long have you had them?" "Since the war." He lowered his hands, and in the moonlight she could see his face was wet, not just with sweat. 20 years now. They come less often than they used to, but what do you dream about?" For a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, haltingly, he began to speak. "I was 19, Boaz said, his voice distant. "Just a boy, really, though I thought I was a man. Signed up for the Indian Wars because I was young and stupid and thought war was about glory." Abigail sat quietly, letting him tell it at his own pace. "There was a battle, a bad one. We were supposed to be defending settlers from a raiding party, but it turned into chaos. I killed a man that day, a boy, really, maybe 16. Confederate sympathizer fighting with the tribes." His hands clenched on the sheets. "He was dying. Took him a while. And he kept asking me to tell his mother. Tell her he wasn't scared. Tell her he did his duty." Boaz's voice broke. "I never did. I don't even know his name. Don't know where his mother was. But I see his face every time I close my eyes, and I hear him asking me to deliver a message I'll never be able to give." Abigail felt tears on her own cheeks. "You were following orders, doing what you thought was right. Does that make it better?" He looked at her, and the pain in his eyes was bottomless. "I took a life, Abigail. A boy who probably had parents waiting for him, maybe brothers and sisters. And for what? For land? For politics? For things that didn't matter a damn to two boys bleeding in the dirt?" She didn't have an answer for that. Maybe there wasn't one. "After the war," he continued, "I came home, tried to forget, threw myself into work, told myself it was over, but it's never over, not really. And when I hold a gun now," he shuddered, "I swore I'd never kill again, no matter what." "Even to defend yourself?" "I don't know." His honesty was raw. "I hope I never have to find out." They sat in silence for a while, the moonlight painting everything in shades of silver and shadow. Finally, Abigail said, "Would it help if I stayed? Until you fall back asleep?" He looked at her, surprise and something like gratitude in his expression. "You don't have to." "I know, but I'd like to, if you'd like me to." He nodded, unable to speak. So Abigail pulled the chair from his desk over to the bedside and sat down. She didn't touch him. That felt too intimate still, but she sat close enough that he could see her in the darkness. Close enough that he wasn't alone. Eventually, his breathing slowed, deepened, his eyes closed, and still she sat there, keeping watch over this giant of a man who carried wounds no one could see. When dawn light began to creep through the window, she finally rose to go, but his hand caught hers. "Thank you," he whispered, eyes still closed, "for not running, for not judging." "We all carry things," she said softly. "You've been patient with mine." She left him then, returned to her own room, but something fundamental had shifted between them. He'd shown her his deepest wound, and she hadn't flinched. That morning at breakfast they didn't speak about the night. But when he poured her coffee, his hand lingered on hers for just a moment. And when she smiled at him, he smiled back, tentative but real. Dutch paused in his telling, watching the fire. Outside, the wind had picked up, howling around the cabin like a living thing. "That's when they stopped being strangers," he said quietly. "That's when the partnership became something more." "Did the nightmares stop?" the bride asked. "No, but she started sleeping with her door open, And on the bad nights, when he woke up screaming, she'd go to him, sit with him. Sometimes she'd read to him, poetry usually. Her voice seemed to settle something in him. Dutch smiled. "Your grandmother had a beautiful reading voice. Did you know that?" Samuel shook his head, eyes bright with unshed tears. "Well, she did, like honey and smoke. And when she read Tennyson to your grandfather in the deep night, it was like medicine for old wounds." The weeks that followed were gentle ones. Autumn deepened toward winter, the prairie grass turning from gold to brown. Abigail and Boaz fell into rhythms that felt almost natural. She taught during the days. He worked the ranch. But the evenings were theirs, time they spent learning each other in small increments. One afternoon she came home to find him building something in the yard. When she approached, she saw it was raised beds for a kitchen garden. "Thought you might like to plant come spring," he said, straightening. "Dutch mentioned you used to have a garden at your cottage. Figured you'd want one here, too." The beds were beautifully made, the wood smooth and level. He'd clearly spent hours on them. "They're perfect," she said. Then, impulsively, "Help me plan what to plant. I've never had this much space before." So they sat on the porch steps together, her with paper and pencil, sketching out where carrots and beans and lettuce might go. His large hands moved over the drawing, suggesting additions, asking questions about what she liked to cook. It was ordinary, domestic, the kind of scene married couples probably had all the time, but for them it felt precious, evidence that this strange arrangement was becoming something real. "I've never had anyone to plant a future with before," Boaz said quietly, watching her sketch. Abigail looked up at him. "Neither have I." Their eyes met, and for a long moment neither of them looked away. Then Boaz cleared his throat, breaking the spell. "I should get back to work. Got fences to check before dark." But as he stood, his hand brushed her shoulder, just briefly, just gently. But it was the first time he'd touched her since their wedding day. It was during this period of quiet building that Abigail first visited the North Pasture. She'd been curious about it since Boaz's first mention, the place where his father had died, the land Marcus Blackwood seemed so interested in. One afternoon, when lessons ended early, she asked Boaz if he'd show it to her. His expression closed immediately. "There's nothing to see, just grass and rocks." "Then why won't you take me?" He was silent for a long moment. Then, "Because I don't like going there. Because of your father? Because of everything." But he sighed, seeming to make a decision. "All right, if you want to see it, I'll show you." They rode out together, her on a gentle mare he'd selected for her, him on his massive bay. The North Pasture was about 20 minutes from the ranch house, separated from the rest of the property by a natural ridge. It was beautiful land, rolling hills with good grass, a creek running through it, cottonwood trees providing shade, prime grazing country. But Boaz led her to a specific spot, a flat area near the creek where a single large stone sat, smooth and gray. "That's where I found him," he said quietly, not dismounting. "Right there, still warm but already gone." Abigail felt her throat tighten. "Tell me what happened, please." He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he began to speak, and it was like a dam breaking. Dutch leaned forward in his chair, his voice dropping into the cadence of memory. "I was there that day," he said. 20 years ago. I remember it like it was yesterday." He closed his eyes, and when he spoke again, it was like he was seeing it all over again. It was September, just like when Abigail and Boaz married. Dutch had been riding in from the South Pasture, checking on a sick cow, when he saw young Boaz coming at a gallop, his horse lathered with sweat. The boy, he was only 17 then, more boy than man despite his size, was white-faced and shaking. "Dutch! Dutch! Something's wrong with Pa. He's in the North Pasture and he won't wake up." They rode together hard and fast, but Dutch knew even before they got there. He'd seen enough death in his time to recognize it in Boaz's voice. Michael Cutter lay on his back near the creek, eyes open to the sky. His face was peaceful, like he'd just laid down to rest, but he was gone. "Pa!" Boaz kept saying, kneeling beside his father, shaking him. "Pa, wake up, please wake up." "He's gone, son," Dutch said gently, putting a hand on the boy's massive shoulder. "I'm sorry. He's gone." "But he can't be. He was fine this morning. He was fine." Dutch checked the body anyway, following the protocols. No visible wounds, no signs of struggle. Michael's pocket watch was still ticking in his vest pocket. "Heart attack most like," Dutch said. "Sometimes a man's heart just stops, even a strong man." But as he said it, he noticed something. Michael's hands were scraped, fresh scrapes, like he'd been in a scuffle. And there were boot prints in the dirt nearby. Not Michael's boots. Someone else had been here. "Did your pa have any arguments lately?" Dutch asked carefully. "Any disputes with neighbors?" Young Boaz was crying now, big helpless sobs that shook his whole frame. "Marcus Blackwood. They've been arguing about water rights, about the boundary between our properties. But Pa said he'd never sell this pasture. Never." Dutch looked at those boot prints again, looked at the scraped hands, and felt a cold certainty settle in his gut. But the sheriff, when he came, was satisfied with heart attack. No investigation, just a tragedy. These things happened. At the funeral Marcus Blackwood had attended, dressed in expensive black, face appropriately somber. He'd stood at the graveside and said all the right things about what a good neighbor Michael Cutter had been. Dutch had watched him carefully, and he'd seen it, just for a moment when Blackwood thought no one was looking. A small smile. Satisfied. "I never told Boaz what I suspected," Dutch said, voice heavy with old guilt. "He was 17, grieving, trying to run a ranch he wasn't ready for. What good would it do to tell him his father might have been murdered?" "But you thought Blackwood killed him?" Samuel said. "I knew it. In my bones I knew it. But knowing and proving are different things." Dutch knocked ash from his pipe. "So I kept quiet, helped young Boaz as best I could. Watched him grow into a man under the weight of a promise he'd made to a dying father." In the present, Abigail listened as Boaz told her about finding his father, about the confusion and grief, about the promise Michael had extracted from his son in those final moments. He said, "This land, Boaz, don't let them take it. Your ma's buried here. I'll be buried here. Promise me, son." And I promised. I didn't even know who them was, but I promised. "And you've kept that promise for 20 years, Abigail said softly, "like a chain around my neck." His voice was raw. "I've turned down offers for this land. Good offers. I could have sold it, bought land somewhere else, started fresh. But I can't. I gave my word." Abigail looked at the flat stone, at the grass growing around it. This wasn't just about land. This was about a 17-year-old boy trying to honor a father who died too soon. "Your father would be proud of you," she said. "Would he?" Boaz's laugh was bitter. "I'm not so sure. Sometimes I think I'm not protecting his legacy. I'm just stuck, too afraid to move on." She turned in her saddle to look at him directly. "You're not stuck, Boaz. You're loyal. There's a difference." "Is there?" "Yes." She said it with conviction. Loyalty is choosing to honor someone. Being stuck is not knowing how to let go. You know the difference. You chose to marry me. To make a future, that's not being stuck. He looked at her with such gratitude that she felt her chest tighten. "Thank you," he said, "for understanding, for not thinking I'm crazy for caring this much about a piece of ground." "It's not just ground," she said. "It's where your father's last moments were. It's holy ground. I understand that." They sat there for a while in silence, looking at the land that had cost so much. Then Boaz said, very quietly, "Abigail, if something happened to me, if Blackwood or anyone else came for this land, promise me you'd fight for it. Not because of me, because it's yours now, too. Our land, our legacy." "Nothing's going to happen to you," she said. "Promise me anyway." She looked at him, this gentle giant who carried so much old pain, who'd opened his life to her without asking for anything in return except partnership. And she made a decision. "I promise," she said. "But we fight for it together. Not me, alone. Us." He nodded, and something in his expression eased. "Together." They rode back to the ranch house as the sun was setting, painting the prairie in shades of fire. And when they dismounted, Boaz's hand found hers and held it, just for a moment. "Thank you," he said, "for standing with me." "Always," she replied, and meant it. Dutch paused to refill his coffee. Samuel and his bride sat in rapt silence. "That's when I knew," Dutch said, watching them ride back that day. They weren't play-acting at marriage anymore. They were becoming real partners, and that scared me. "Why scared?" the bride asked. "Because I knew what was coming. I knew Marcus Blackwood wouldn't let this lie. And I knew that if he came for that land, he'd have to go through both of them now, not just Boaz. Both." The warning came on a gray November morning. Abigail was at the schoolhouse, teaching geography to the older students, when she saw a woman on horseback approaching. Not unusual. Parents sometimes visited during lessons. But as the rider drew closer, Abigail's breath caught. Catherine Blackwood. She'd seen Marcus's wife before, of course. Catherine attended church, though she always sat alone, Marcus beside her, but somehow separate. She was beautiful in a fragile way, like porcelain that might shatter if touched too hard. "Children, continue with your maps," Abigail said. "I'll be just outside." Catherine had dismounted and was waiting on the steps. Up close, Abigail could see shadows under her eyes, a tightness around her mouth that spoke of tension held too long. "Mrs. Cutter," Catherine said. Her voice was cultured, educated. "Forgive the intrusion. I need to speak with you." "Of course. Is everything all right?" Catherine laughed, a sound with no humor in it. "No, nothing is all right, but She glanced around nervously. "I came to warn you." Abigail felt her stomach tighten. "Warn me about what?" "My husband, Catherine struggled for words. "He's planning something. I don't know exactly what. But I hear him talking to those men he's hired. And I hear your name. Your husband's name. The North Pasture." "What kind of planning?" "I don't know. Marcus doesn't confide in me, but I know him. I know when he's working toward something, and I know it's dangerous." She reached out suddenly, gripped Abigail's arm. "Leave Red Fern Ridge, please, while you still can. Take your husband and go somewhere Marcus can't reach you." "I can't do that," Abigail said. "This is our home." "Then you're a fool." Catherine's voice was sharp with fear. "Do you know what he's capable of? Do you know what he's already done?" "What has he done?" But Catherine was already backing away, shaking her head. "I've said too much. If he knew I was here—" She mounted her horse quickly. "Just go, please, before it's too late." She rode away before Abigail could ask more questions. Abigail stood on the schoolhouse steps, her mind racing. Catherine's terror had been real. Whatever Marcus Blackwood was planning, his own wife was afraid of it. That evening, she told Boaz about the visit. He listened grimly, his jaw tightening. "She's right to be scared," he said. "Blackwood's not a man who gives up. If he wants this land, he'll find a way to take it. But we have the law on our side. The deeds are clear. The law doesn't always matter out here, Abigail." He looked at her, and there was something hard in his eyes she hadn't seen before. "Men like Blackwood make their own law. Then we fight him legally. We get lawyers. And if that doesn't work?" The question hung between them. Abigail thought of the rifle she'd seen in Boaz's study, the one he'd sworn never to use again. "Then we find another way," she said firmly. "But we don't run, and we don't let him intimidate us." Boaz studied her for a long moment. Then, unexpectedly, he smiled. "You're braver than I am." "No, I'm just tired of being afraid. Tired of letting powerful men dictate my life." She met his eyes. "I've spent 8 years being poor Miss Wynne. I'm not going to spend the rest of my life being a victim." Something shifted in his expression. Pride, maybe, or recognition. "All right," he said. "We stand our ground. But Abigail, I need you to understand something. If this comes to violence, I know about the war, about your vow. It's more than a vow. It's—" He struggled for words. "I can't kill again. I can't become that person, even to protect the land." "Then we find a way to protect ourselves without killing," she said, though even as she said it, she wondered if that was possible. The next few weeks brought an uneasy peace. Blackwood didn't approach them directly, but there were signs of his presence. Fences cut, cattle driven off their usual grazing areas, small harassments that were hard to prove but impossible to ignore. Dutch and 2 other ranch hands started sleeping in shifts, keeping watch. The ranch took on the feeling of a fortress under siege, and through it all, Abigail and Boaz drew closer together, not through passion or romance, but through the simple necessity of standing side by side against a common threat. One evening, Abigail was grading papers in the parlor when Boaz came in from checking the perimeter. He looked tired, the lamplight catching the silver in his hair. "Everything quiet?" she asked. "For now." He settled into his chair, picked up the book he'd been reading, but after a moment he set it down again. "Abigail, I've been thinking. If something happens to me—" "Don't," she said sharply. "We have to talk about this. If Blackwood makes a move and I can't, if I'm not able to protect us, you need to know where the important documents are. The real deeds, the account books, everything." She set down her pen, giving him her full attention. "Show me." So he did. Spent the next hour showing her where everything was kept, how the ranch accounts worked, which men in town could be trusted if she needed help. It was practical, necessary information, but underneath it was the unspoken fear that he might not be there to handle these things himself. When they finished, Abigail said quietly, "You're not going to die, Boaz. We're going to get through this. I hope you're right." "I am right." She stood, moved to sit on the arm of his chair. It was the closest they'd been since their wedding. "Because we're in this together. And together, we're stronger than he is." Boaz looked up at her, and in his eyes she saw something she hadn't seen before. Not just gratitude or respect. Something deeper. Something that might, given time, become love. His hand found hers, and they sat like that for a long moment, not speaking, just being together in the lamplight, drawing strength from each other's presence. Outside, the November wind howled around the house. Winter was coming early. They could feel it in the air, taste it on the wind. And somewhere in the darkness, Marcus Blackwood was planning his next move. But for now, in this moment, they were safe. Together. And that was enough. Dutch paused in his telling, staring into the fire. The logs had burned down to coals again, glowing like dragon's eyes in the darkness. "That's where I'll stop for tonight," he said. "Getting late, and these old bones need rest." "But what happened next?" Samuel's bride protested. "Did Blackwood attack?" "Tomorrow," Dutch said firmly. "This story's been waiting 20 years. It can wait one more night." As Samuel and his bride prepared to leave, pulling on coats and gloves, Dutch called after them, "Tomorrow I'll tell you about the discovery, about what Abigail found that changed everything, about the day she proved she was braver than any of us gave her credit for." They rode away into the snowy darkness, and Dutch closed the door. But before he banked the fire, he pulled out that old pocket watch again, opened it, looked at the young couple in the photograph. "She saved you," he said softly to the image of Michael Cutter. "Your boy was drowning in grief and duty, and she pulled him back to the surface, made him see he could honor you by living, not just by holding on to ghosts." He closed the watch, set it on the mantel. Tomorrow he'd tell them about the investigation, about Abigail's courage, about the moment when everything came to a head and the whole county had to choose sides. But tonight he let the story rest. Outside, the first heavy snow of winter had begun to fall, covering the prairie in white, covering the north pasture where a man had died 20 years ago, and a promise had been made that would shape 2 lives. The past was always there just under the surface, but so was the future, and Abigail and Boaz had chosen the future together. The third evening, Samuel and his bride arrived as the last light was fading from the western sky. Dutch had the fire going strong, and something simmering on the stove that made the cabin smell of beef and onions. "Stew," he said, seeing their curious looks. "Can't tell a story this long without feeding folks properly. Sit down, eat first, then I'll tell you about how your grandmother became a detective." They ate from tin bowls, the stew rich and warming. Outside the wind had picked up, driving snow against the windows in white gusts. "Storm's getting worse," Samuel observed. "Good night for it," Dutch said. "The night I'm about to tell you about, the night everything changed, was just like this. Cold, dark, snow coming." He set down his empty bowl. But Abigail Cutter wasn't the kind of woman to let a little weather stop her when she'd made up her mind about something. He settled into his chair, pipe in hand. "Last night I told you about Catherine's warning, about the uneasy peace that settled over the ranch. Well, that peace didn't last long. And it was your grandmother who broke it wide open." It started 3 nights after Catherine's visit. Abigail couldn't sleep. She lay in her bed listening to the house settle, the wind outside, the distant sound of cattle lowing. But her mind wouldn't quiet. Catherine's fear had been real. The harassment of the ranch was escalating, and Boaz, she could see the strain in him, the way his hand went to his vest pocket more frequently, touching his father's watch like a talisman, the way he startled at sudden sounds. Finally, she gave up on sleep, pulled on her robe, and went downstairs to the study where Boaz kept the ranch records. She'd always been good at puzzles. It was part of what made her a good teacher, the ability to see patterns, to connect disparate pieces of information. And there was a puzzle here. She could feel it. Marcus Blackwood wanted the North Pasture, had wanted it for 20 years. But why? What made that particular piece of land worth murdering for? She lit a lamp and began going through the documents Boaz had shown her. Property deeds, survey maps, tax records going back decades. The original deed for the North Pasture was dated 1855, 27 years ago, purchased by Michael Cutter from, she squinted at the faded ink, from a Harrison Blackwood, Marcus's father. Abigail sat back, mind racing. So the land had once belonged to the Blackwood family. Michael Cutter had bought it legally, but from the son's perspective, that might feel like theft, like something stolen that should be returned. She kept reading, following the paper trail. The sale price had been low, suspiciously low, almost like Harrison Blackwood had been desperate to sell. There had to be more to this story. Dutch paused to relight his pipe, which had gone out while he talked. "That's when she started investigating for real," he said. "Not just looking at papers in Boaz's study. She went into town, started asking questions, careful-like so nobody would know what she was really after." "What did she find?" Samuel asked. "Patience, boy, I'm getting there." The next day, Abigail told Boaz she needed supplies from town. He offered to come with her, but she declined. "You need to stay with the cattle," she said. "I'll be fine. It's broad daylight." What she didn't tell him was that she had a different kind of errand in mind. Her first stop was the land office, housed in a cramped room above the mercantile. The clerk was a nervous man named Peterson, who'd held the position for 30 years. "Mr. Peterson," Abigail said, putting on her best schoolteacher smile. "I'm working on a local history project with my students, teaching them about how Red Fern Ridge was settled. I was hoping to look at some of the old property records." Peterson beamed. "What a wonderful educational project, of course, of course. What time period are you interested in?" "The 1850s mostly, when the first ranches were being established." He brought out heavy ledgers, dusty with age. Abigail spent 2 hours going through them, taking careful notes. The story they told was fascinating. Harrison Blackwood had owned significant property in 1850, nearly twice what his son Marcus owned now. But between 1852 and 1856, he'd sold off piece after piece, always at low prices, always to different buyers. The North Pasture had been the last piece to go, sold to Michael Cutter in 1855 for a price that was almost insulting in its smallness. "Mr. Peterson," Abigail said carefully, "do you remember Harrison Blackwood, Marcus's father?" "Oh, sure. Died before you came to town, though. Sad story, that." "How did he die?" Peterson lowered his voice, though they were alone. "Took his own life. Shot himself in 1856, year after he sold that last piece of land to Michael Cutter. Left his widow nearly penniless and young Marcus, he was only about 10 years old, with nothing but shame and debt." Abigail felt ice settle in her stomach. Why did he kill himself? Gambling debts, mostly. Story was he lost the North Pasture in a poker game to Michael Cutter, but couldn't stand the shame of handing it over. So he sold it instead for whatever Michael would pay. Then Peterson made a gesture like a gun to his head. Couldn't live with what he'd done. Suicide. A 10-year-old boy losing his father to shame and despair. A mother left with nothing. Abigail was beginning to understand Marcus Blackwood. Not forgive, never that, but understand. Her next stop was Dr. Morrison's office. She found him between patients, organizing his medical supplies. "Abigail," he said warmly, "is everything all right? Boaz isn't ill?" "No, nothing like that. I wanted to ask you something about the day Michael Cutter died." Dr. Morrison's smile faded. "That was 20 years ago." "I know, but you examined the body, didn't you?" "I did. Heart attack, the sheriff was satisfied." "Were you satisfied?" The doctor was quiet for a long moment. Then he closed the door to his office and gestured for her to sit. "No," he said finally. "I wasn't satisfied. Michael Cutter was 42 years old, strong as an ox. Heart attacks happened, certainly, but there were inconsistencies." "What kind of inconsistencies?" "His hands were scraped, like he'd been in a fight, and there were bruises on his chest, fresh ones, like someone had pushed him down." Dr. Morrison's expression was troubled. "But the sheriff didn't want to investigate. Said I was seeing things that weren't there. And Marcus Blackwood, well, he was already the most powerful man in the county by then. Nobody wanted to accuse him without proof." "Did you suspect him?" "I suspected someone, but suspicion isn't evidence." He looked at her directly. "Why are you asking about this now?" Abigail made a decision. Trust had to start somewhere. "Because I think Marcus Blackwood murdered Michael Cutter to get that land back. The land his father lost. And I think he's been planning for 20 years to finish what he started." Dr. Morrison didn't look surprised. "I've thought the same thing for 2 decades. But like I said, suspicion isn't proof." "Then we need to find proof," Abigail said. That night she told Boaz what she'd learned. They sat at the kitchen table, the lamp burning low between them, while she laid out the whole story. Harrison Blackwood's gambling, the loss of the land, the suicide, a 10-year-old Marcus watching his world collapse. "My God," Boaz said softly. "I never knew. Pa never told me how he acquired that land. I always assumed he'd bought it normally." "In a way, he did. Harrison sold it to him. But Marcus probably sees it differently. He sees his father's humiliation. The land that should have been his inheritance, stolen by the man whose son now owns it." "It wasn't stolen," Boaz said, but his voice lacked conviction. "No, but to a boy who lost everything, who watched his father kill himself over shame, it might feel that way." They sat in silence for a moment. Then Boaz said, "This doesn't change anything. He still murdered my father, if that's what he did. Dr. Morrison thinks so. He saw the evidence, scraped hands, bruises, signs of a struggle. Why didn't he tell me?" "You were 17, grieving. What good would it have done?" Abigail reached across the table, took his hand. "But we know now, and we can use that knowledge." "How?" "I don't know yet, but there has to be proof somewhere. Documents, witnesses, something that connects him to your father's death." Boaz looked at her with something like awe. "You're not going to let this go, are you?" "Would you? If someone murdered the person you loved?" The words hung between them. Person you loved. She'd said it without thinking, but now it was there, out in the open. "No," Boaz said quietly. "I wouldn't let it go." Dutch shifted in his chair, the old wood creaking. "That's when she really became dangerous," he said. "Not because she was angry. Anger burns itself out. But because she was methodical, patient, using that teacher's mind of hers to work through the puzzle piece by piece." "What did she do next?" the bride asked. "Went to the church library, said she was looking for historical documents for her students, and she found something that changed everything." The church library was small, just one room attached to the back of the building, filled with donated books and old newspapers. Abigail told Reverend Matthews she was researching local history, which wasn't entirely a lie. She spent 3 afternoons going through old newspapers, town records, anything that might mention the Blackwoods or the Cutters or the North Pasture. On the 3rd day, she found it. She was looking through a book on cattle breeding, not because she expected to find anything there, but because she was being thorough, when a folded paper fell from between the pages. At first glance, it looked like just another land deed, but Abigail's teacher's eye caught the inconsistencies immediately. The paper was aged, certainly, but the ink was too dark, too fresh for a document that claimed to be 23 years old. The handwriting attempted to mimic the formal script of official documents from the 1850s, but it had subtle characteristics that marked it as much more recent. Certain letter formations, the pressure of the pen, details that someone trying to forge an old document might miss. But most damning of all was the surveyor's seal at the bottom. Thomas Hartley, licensed surveyor. Abigail knew Thomas Hartley. He'd surveyed some property for the school board 2 years ago. He'd only been licensed in the territory for 3 years, yet this document claimed to be from 1859. And there was more. In the margins of the document, someone had made corrections, practice runs of the handwriting, different variations of the same signature, as if the forger had been perfecting their technique. This wasn't just a forged deed, this was a practice copy. Someone had been preparing to create a false document claiming that the North Pasture actually belonged to Marcus Blackwood, and they'd forgotten to remove their rough draft from the book where they'd been working. Abigail's hands shook as she carefully refolded the document and tucked it into her reticule. This was it. This was the proof they needed. She was so focused on her discovery that she didn't notice someone watching her from the church doorway until she was leaving. Marcus Blackwood stood there, hat in hand, that charming smile on his face. "Mrs. Cutter," he said pleasantly, "doing research?" Abigail's heart hammered, but she kept her voice steady. "For my students. Local history project. How educational." His eyes went to her reticule, where the document was hidden. "Find anything interesting?" "Just old newspapers. Cattle prices from 20 years ago. Quite dull, actually." He stepped aside to let her pass, but as she did, he said quietly, "You should be careful, Mrs. Cutter. Old documents can be fragile. Sometimes they fall apart when handled too roughly." It wasn't a threat, not quite, but the meaning was clear. Abigail met his eyes. "I'm always careful with important documents, Mr. Blackwood. I'm a teacher. We're trained to preserve what's valuable." "Of course." His smile never wavered. "Give my regards to your husband. Tell him we should talk soon, about property boundaries, about the future." He tipped his hat and walked away, leaving Abigail standing in the cold November air, the forged document burning against her ribs like evidence of a crime. When she got home, she found Boaz in the barn with Dutch, examining a lame horse. The moment he saw her face, he knew something had happened. "What is it?" She didn't answer until they were inside the house, door closed, curtains drawn. Then she pulled out the document and laid it on the kitchen table. Boaz and Dutch bent over it, reading carefully. As the implications sank in, Boaz's expression went from confused to shocked to coldly furious. "This is a forgery," he said. "A practice copy of a forged deed." "Yes," Abigail confirmed. "Someone, probably Blackwood himself, has been preparing to claim that the North Pasture actually belongs to him, based on a false document." Dutch's weathered face had gone pale. "He's been planning this for years, waiting for the right moment." "And now he thinks he has it," Abigail said. "With me here, a wife who could be threatened, a reason for Boaz to be distracted." "But we have proof now," Boaz said, touching the document like it might burn him. "We can take this to the territorial authorities. Expose him." "Can we?" Abigail asked. "What does this prove, exactly?" "That someone practiced forging a deed. We can't prove it was Blackwood. We can't prove he planned to use it. A good lawyer could argue this means nothing." "Then what do we do with it?" We use it to make him reveal himself, Abigail said. We let him know we have it, and we see what he does. That's dangerous, Dutch said. If he knows you found his practice copy, he might— He already knows, Abigail interrupted. He saw me at the church. He knows I found something. We can't put that cat back in the bag. Boaz looked at her with concern and pride warring in his expression. You went into town alone, investigated, found this, all without telling me. I didn't want to worry you until I had something concrete. Abigail, he took her hands in his, we're partners. That means we don't face dangers alone, not anymore. The gentleness in his voice, the genuine concern made her throat tight. I know, I'm sorry, I needed to do something. I couldn't sit here waiting while Blackwood made his plans. I understand. He squeezed her hands gently. But from now on, we do this together. Agreed? Agreed. Dutch cleared his throat. Hate to interrupt, but we need to decide what to do next. If Blackwood knows you've found something, he'll move soon. Probably force a confrontation before you can use what you've found against him. Let him come, Boaz said, his voice hard. We'll be ready. But Abigail saw his hand go to his vest pocket, touching the watch. Saw the tension in his shoulders. He was trying to sound brave, but she knew what it cost him, knew what he'd sworn never to do again. Boaz, she said quietly, if it comes to violence, I know what I said about never killing again. But if it's you or him— He stopped, jaw working. I don't know what I'll do, and that terrifies me. Dutch paused to stoke the fire. The cabin had grown cold as the story darkened. That was a hard night, he said, knowing what was coming, knowing that boy would have to choose between the vow he'd made to himself and protecting the woman he loved. He loved her by then? The bride asked. Oh, yes. He just hadn't said it yet. Neither of them had. But it was there. You could see it in how they looked at each other, how they stood closer without realizing it, how they finished each other's sentences. Dutch smiled sadly. Love doesn't always announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it just grows quiet, like grass after rain. You don't see it happening until one day you look and it's everywhere. 2 days later, Catherine Blackwood appeared at the schoolhouse again, but this time she didn't wait for school to end. She came during lessons, pale and shaking. Abigail excused herself, leaving Sarah Mitchell in charge of the younger children. Outside, Catherine gripped her arm hard enough to bruise. You found it, didn't you? The practice deed? How did you— Because Marcus is in a rage, tearing apart his study, screaming about documents going missing. He knows someone found his forgery. Catherine's eyes were wild with fear. He's going to act soon. Tomorrow, maybe the day after. He's gathering men, paying them. What's he planning? I don't know exactly, but I heard him talking about the North Pasture, about how it should have been his, about how he's waited 20 years to correct his father's mistake. She pulled Abigail closer. He killed Michael Cutter. I know he did. I've known for years. How do you know? Because he told me. The admission came out like a sob. 5 years ago, drunk on whiskey and triumph after acquiring the Henderson property, he told me how easy it was, how Michael argued with him about water rights, and Marcus just pushed him hard. Michael fell, hit his head on that rock, and Marcus stood there and watched him die. Abigail felt sick. Why didn't you tell anyone? Because I was afraid, because I knew what he'd do to me if I betrayed him, and because— Catherine's voice broke. Because I'm a coward. I chose my own safety over justice, and I've had to live with that for 5 years. Catherine, no, don't comfort me. I don't deserve it. She pressed something into Abigail's hand, a key. This is to Marcus's desk, the locked drawer in his study. That's where he keeps the real deed, the forged one he plans to use, and there's more. Records of other properties he's stolen, evidence of crimes going back 20 years. Why are you giving this to me now? Because you fought back. Because you didn't run when I told you to. Because you're braver than I ever was. Catherine's eyes filled with tears. And because I'm leaving. Tonight. I'm taking what money I can carry and going east, as far from Marcus Blackwood as I can get. But before I go, I wanted to give you a chance to stop him. Come with us to the authorities. Testify. I can't. I'm sorry, I'm too afraid. But take the key, use what you find. And for God's sake, be careful, he's more dangerous than you know." Catherine was on her horse and riding away before Abigail could say more. That night, Abigail told Boaz and Dutch about Catherine's visit, about the confession, about the key. "We need to get into that desk," Abigail said. "Tonight, while Blackwood is distracted." "Absolutely not," Boaz said immediately. "You're not breaking into that man's house." "Then you do it." "Neither of us are doing it. It's too dangerous." "It's the only way to get real proof," Abigail argued. "Catherine said there are records, evidence of other crimes. If we can get that, if we get caught, we're dead," Boaz said flatly. "Blackwood won't hesitate. Not now." They argued for an hour. Finally, Dutch intervened. "I'll do it," he said. They both turned to stare at him. "You're 70 years old," Boaz said. 52, and mind your manners." Dutch stood straighter. "I've been watching the Blackwood place for weeks. I know their routines. I know which windows stick and which don't. I can get in and out without anyone knowing. Dutch, boy, I've been working for your family since before you were born. I loved your father like a brother. If there is a chance to prove what Blackwood did to him, I'm taking it." His voice was firm. "You two stay here. Keep watch. If I'm not back by midnight, assume I'm caught and get yourselves to safety." "We're not abandoning you," Abigail said. "You will if I tell you to. I'm an old man. You two have your whole lives ahead of you." He took the key from Abigail. "Now, where exactly is this desk?" Dutch paused in his telling, smiled at Samuel and his bride's rapt expressions. "Bet you're wondering how I got this story so detailed," he said. "Especially this next part." "You were there," Samuel said. "You broke into Blackwood's house." "I did indeed." Dutch's eyes gleamed in the firelight. "One of the few truly foolish things I've done in my life, but also one of the bravest, if I do say so myself." He settled back into his chair. "Now, this is where the story gets interesting." Dutch approached the Blackwood ranch house just after 10 o'clock. The main house was dark except for one lamp burning in what he knew was Marcus's study. He'd watched this place enough to know the patterns. Marcus would drink until midnight, then stumble to bed. The hired hands stayed in the bunkhouse. And Catherine, well, if she'd meant what she said, she was already gone. Dutch waited in the shadow of a cottonwood tree, patient as stone. Finally, around 11, the lamp went out. He gave it another 30 minutes, then moved. The window Catherine had mentioned was on the east side, a parlor window that didn't latch properly. He'd seen her leave it slightly open on wash days to air out the rooms. It stuck, but not badly. Dutch was old but still strong. He got it open with minimal noise and slipped inside. The house smelled of whiskey and tobacco and something else. Fear, maybe, or desperation. Dutch moved through the dark parlor into the hallway, counting doors until he found the study. Inside it was pitch black. He risked lighting a small candle, shielding it with his hand. The desk was exactly where Catherine had described it, large oak with a locked drawer on the right side. Dutch pulled out the key and tried it. The lock turned smoothly, too smoothly, like it had been oiled recently, like someone used this drawer often. Inside was a stack of papers. Dutch lifted them carefully, holding the candle close. The top document was the forged deed. Not a practice copy like Abigail had found, but the finished product. Official-looking stamps, signatures, dates, all perfectly forged. Below that were more documents. Property transfers from other ranches that had mysteriously gone out of business. Bills of sale that looked suspiciously altered. And Dutch's hands began to shake. A ledger. In Marcus Blackwood's own handwriting, a record of payments made. To whom and for what? September 1862. J. Reeves, $50. Convincing Michael Cutter to meet at North Pasture. September 1862. $100 to Sheriff Williams. Ruling death as natural causes. And more. So much more. 20 years of corruption and murder laid out in neat columns like business expenses. Dutch was so focused on the ledger that he didn't hear the footsteps until it was too late. Find something interesting? Marcus Blackwood stood in the doorway, silhouetted by lamplight from the hall. He was holding a rifle. Dutch slowly straightened, keeping his hands visible. Just looking for proof. Found plenty. Yes, you did, unfortunately for you. Blackwood stepped into the room, closing the door behind him. I should have burned these years ago, but I'm a careful man. I like to keep records. Never know when you might need leverage. Your wife told us everything, Dutch said, stalling for time. My wife is gone, took half my money, and ran like the coward she is. Blackwood's smile was cold. But it doesn't matter. I'll say you broke in to steal, that I shot you in self-defense, your word against mine, except you won't be alive to give your word. He raised the rifle. Dutch didn't think. He grabbed the ledger and threw it at Blackwood's face, then dove for the window. The rifle fired, but the shot went wild. Dutch felt something burn across his shoulder, but didn't stop. He hit the window at full speed, glass shattering around him, and rolled when he hit the ground outside. Behind him, he could hear Blackwood shouting. Men were emerging from the bunkhouse, roused by the gunshot. Dutch ran. He was old, but fear gave him speed. He made it to where he'd tied his horse, threw himself into the saddle, and rode hard toward the Cutter ranch. The ledger was still clutched in his bleeding hand. Abigail and Boaz heard the horse coming at a gallop and ran outside, Boaz grabbing his rifle on the way. Dutch practically fell from his saddle, blood soaking his shirt, the ledger pressed against his chest. Got it, he gasped. Got everything. But Blackwood knows. He's coming. They got him inside, Abigail pressing cloths to the wound while Boaz examined the ledger by lamplight. My God, Boaz breathed. This is a confession. Everything. The bribe to the sheriff. The payments to the man who lured my father to the North Pasture. 20 years of crimes. He'll come for it, Dutch said through gritted teeth. Tonight, tomorrow, soon. Let him come, Boaz said, but his hands were shaking as he held the ledger. His eyes had gone distant, and Abigail knew he was seeing that battlefield again, the dying boy, the blood on his hands. Boaz, she said quietly, we need to get to town. Show this to the territorial marshal. Let the law handle it. The law? Boaz laughed bitterly. The sheriff was bought 20 years ago. Who's to say the current one isn't bought now? Then we go to the territorial authorities. We ride to Cheyenne if we have to. And leave the ranch undefended? Leave everything my father died for? He shook his head. No, we make our stand here. Abigail saw the set of his jaw, the determination mixed with fear in his eyes. He was right in a way. Running wouldn't solve this. Blackwood wouldn't stop, not now that they had evidence. Then we get help, she said. We go to town at first light. Show this to people we trust. Dr. Morrison, Reverend Matthews. Make sure everyone knows what Blackwood did. He can't kill us all. Dutch nodded. Smart. Safety in numbers and witnesses. Boaz looked at the ledger again, then at Abigail. You should go to town. Tonight. Stay with the Reverend. You'll be safe there. I'm not leaving you. Abigail. I said I'm not leaving. Her voice was steel. We're in this together. That's what partners means. For a long moment they stared at each other. Then Boaz nodded slowly. Together. They spent the rest of the night preparing. Boaz loaded weapons he'd sworn never to touch. Dutch, despite his wound, helped check locks and windows. And Abigail copied out the most damning pages of the ledger in case the original was destroyed. Just before dawn, Boaz came to find her in the study where she was writing. If something happens to me, he started. Don't. Listen, please. He knelt beside her chair. If something happens, take the evidence and run. Get to Cheyenne. Make sure people know the truth. Nothing's going to happen to you. You can't promise that. Neither can you. She set down her pen, turned to face him. Boaz, we're both going to survive this. We're both going to see Blackwood brought to justice, and then we're going to live, really live, not just exist. He reached up, touched her face gently. When did you become the brave one? I've always been brave. I just didn't know it until I met you. They stayed like that for a moment, his hand on her face, her hand covering his, not quite a kiss, but something more intimate than one. A promise, wordless and sure. Then the moment broke. Boaz stood. "I need to teach you something." "What?" "How to shoot." Dutch interrupted his own story to poke at the fire. "This is where it gets hard for me to tell," he said. Watching Boaz teach his wife to handle a weapon, knowing what it cost him, knowing he was preparing her for violence he'd sworn to avoid. "Did he regret marrying her?" the bride asked softly. "Pulling her into this danger?" "Never," Dutch was firm. "Not once. But he regretted that the world was the kind of place where a schoolteacher had to learn to shoot. That's different." They went to the barn where the sound wouldn't carry as far. Boaz brought out a pistol, smaller than his rifle, easier for Abigail to handle. "I don't want you to have to use this," he said. "But if Blackwood comes, if things go wrong, I need to know you can protect yourself." He showed her how to hold it, how to aim, how to breathe steady and squeeze the trigger smooth. Her first shot went wide, the recoil surprising her. But Abigail had spent 8 years managing unruly children. She knew how to stay calm under pressure. By the 10th shot, she was hitting the target more often than not. "You're a natural," Boaz said, pride and sorrow mixed in his voice. "I have steady hands, from penmanship." They practiced until the sun came up, until her arms ached and her ears rang. And through it all, Boaz stayed close, his hands steadying hers, his voice calm and patient. "I wish," he said at one point, then stopped. "What?" "I wish we'd had more time before all this, to just be married. To learn each other without fear hanging over us." Abigail lowered the pistol, turned to face him. "We'll have that time. After this is over, we'll have years." "Promise?" "I promise." It was a promise neither of them knew if they could keep, but they needed to believe it anyway. At dawn, they rode to town together, Abigail, Boaz, and Dutch, with his arm in a sling. They went straight to Dr. Morrison's house. The doctor answered in his nightshirt, took one look at their faces, and said, "Come in." They showed him the ledger, watched his expression go from shock to fury. "This is monstrous," he said. 20 years, all these deaths, all this corruption. "Will you help us?" Abigail asked. "We need witnesses, people Blackwood can't intimidate or buy." Dr. Morrison didn't hesitate. "I'll get Reverend Matthews. And we should tell the banker. He's got no love for Blackwood after the Henderson property affair, maybe some of the other ranchers too." Within 2 hours, they'd gathered 8 men in the church. Dr. Morrison, Reverend Matthews, the banker Thomas Henderson, 3 other ranchers who'd had run-ins with Blackwood, and 2 of the town's merchants. Boaz showed them the ledger, explained what it meant, what Blackwood had done. The reaction was immediate and visceral. These were frontier men, hard men, but they had a code, and Marcus Blackwood had violated every part of it. "What do you need from us?" Henderson asked. "Stand with us," Boaz said simply. "When Blackwood comes, and he will come, I need men who'll stand witness, who'll make sure the truth gets out, even if—" He couldn't finish. "Even if you don't survive," Reverend Matthews finished quietly. "We understand, and we'll stand with you." One by one, the men agreed. They would come to the Cutter ranch, bring their own weapons, make sure that whatever happened, Marcus Blackwood wouldn't be able to hide his crimes anymore. As they were leaving the church, Dr. Morrison pulled Abigail aside. "Mrs. Cutter," he said quietly, "I've known Boaz since he came back from the war. He's a good man, a gentle man despite his size. But this situation, it's going to test him in ways he's not prepared for." "I know about the war," Abigail said, "about what he did, what he swore. Then you know he might not be able to pull the trigger when it matters, even to save his own life." The doctor's eyes were kind but serious. "Are you prepared for that, to do what he can't?" Abigail thought about the pistol in her pocket, about the way it had felt in her hand, about the choice she might have to make. "I hope I don't have to find out," she said. "But yes, if it comes to it, I'll do what's necessary." They rode back to the ranch in the early afternoon. The men from town would come at sunset, a show of force, a circle of protection. But as they crested the final hill and saw the ranch house below, they saw something that made Boaz pull up short. Riders, 5 of them, waiting in the ranch yard, Marcus Blackwood and 4 hired guns. "Too early," Dutch muttered. "He's not supposed to come until—" "He's not waiting anymore," Abigail said. She could see it in the way Blackwood sat his horse, the confidence, the certainty of a man making his final move. Boaz's hand went to his rifle, then stopped, trembled. Abigail saw it, saw him freeze, saw the terror bloom in his eyes. Not fear of Blackwood, fear of himself, of what he might have to do. She made a decision. "Stay here," she said. "Both of you. I'm going down there." "The hell you are," Boaz said. But Abigail was already urging her horse forward. She rode down the hill alone, straight toward the 5 armed men, her heart hammering, but her hands steady. When she reached the yard, she stopped 10 feet from Blackwood. "Mrs. Cutter," he said pleasantly, "I was hoping to speak with your husband. You can speak to me instead. I'm his partner." How modern. His smile was cold. "Very well. I'll be direct. You found something that belongs to me. I want it back." "The ledger? The one where you documented every crime you've committed for 20 years? Abigail kept her voice level. "I don't think so. That ledger could be interpreted many ways. It's not the confession you think it is. The territorial marshal will decide that. We've already sent copies to Cheyenne. It was a lie, but Blackwood didn't know that." His expression flickered. Just for a moment, uncertainty crossed his face. "You're lying," he said. "Am I?" Abigail smiled. "You're a gambling man, Mr. Blackwood. Your father was too. Want to bet your freedom on whether I'm telling the truth?" Up on the hill, she could see Boaz and Dutch. Boaz had his rifle now, but he wasn't aiming it. He was just holding it, frozen. Blackwood followed her gaze, saw Boaz's hesitation. "Your husband is a coward," he said, "just like his father. Michael Cutter begged when I killed him, begged for his life like a dog. Is that what you want to spend your life with? A man who can't even raise his rifle to protect his own wife?" The words were calculated, designed to wound, to provoke, but Abigail just smiled. "My husband is the bravest man I know," she said, "because he knows what violence costs. He knows what it means to take a life, and he chooses mercy anyway. That's not cowardice, Mr. Blackwood. That's strength." "Mercy is weakness." "Is it? Your father showed you no mercy when he killed himself and left you with nothing but shame. You've spent 40 years trying to prove you're not weak like he was, but all you've done is become exactly like him, a man who destroys everything he touches." Blackwood's face went purple with rage. "You dare—" "I dare." Abigail's voice rang out clear and strong. "Your father lost that land fairly. My husband's father bought it legally, and you murdered him for it. You're a thief and a coward hiding behind hired guns because you're too afraid to face what you've done." "Enough!" Blackwood's hand went to his pistol, and Abigail pulled hers. She wasn't fast, wasn't practiced, but she was determined. The yard exploded into chaos. Dutch paused, his old hands shaking. "This is where I stop for tonight," he said. "Right there. Right at that moment when your grandmother drew on 5 armed men to protect the man she loved." "You can't stop there." Samuel protested. "I can and I will. It's late. The storm's getting worse. And this part of the story, it needs the right telling. Can't rush it." As Samuel and his bride reluctantly prepared to leave, Dutch called after them, "Tomorrow night, final night. I'll tell you how it ended, how they fought, who lived and who died, and how your grandparents finally said the words they'd been carrying for months." They rode away into the blowing snow, and Dutch closed the door. He stood at the window watching the white darkness. Somewhere out there was the North Pasture, where it had all happened, where blood had been spilled and promises made. He pulled out the pocket watch again, looked at the photograph. "She saved him," he whispered to the image. "In every way a person can be saved, and he saved her right back." Tomorrow he'd tell them the rest, the battle, the choices, the mercy that broke a cycle of violence that had lasted 40 years. But tonight, he let them wonder. Let them imagine. Let them understand that the best stories are the ones worth waiting for. Outside, the snow fell heavier, covering the past, covering the blood. But the truth remained. It always did. And tomorrow, he'd tell it all. The fourth evening, the storm had passed. Samuel and his bride arrived to find Dutch outside his cabin, standing in the snow, looking toward the north pasture. "Dutch?" Samuel called. The old man turned, and in the moonlight they could see his face was wet. "Just paying my respects," he said quietly. "Every year on this night I come out here. Remember what happened. Remember who we lost and who we saved." "Tonight's the anniversary?" the bride asked softly. 20 years ago tonight, the night everything came to a head." Dutch wiped his eyes unselfconsciously. "Come inside. I'll finish the story. It's time." They settled into their familiar places, Samuel and his bride on the bench, Dutch in his chair. But tonight he didn't light his pipe, just sat with his hands folded, staring into the fire. "I left you at the moment your grandmother drew on 5 armed men," he said. "Brave as hell and twice as foolish, but that's what love does, makes you brave and foolish all at once." He took a deep breath. "Let me tell you how it ended." The moment Abigail's pistol cleared her coat, everything slowed down. She saw Blackwood's eyes widen, genuine surprise that this schoolteacher would actually draw on him, saw his hand move toward his own weapon, saw his 4 hired guns reach for their rifles, and then she heard Boaz roar, "Don't you dare touch my wife!" The sound of his voice, raw with fury and terror, broke through his paralysis. He was moving down the hill at a gallop, rifle in hand, Dutch right behind him. But they were too far away, too slow. Blackwood's gun was coming up. Abigail squeezed the trigger. The recoil surprised her. Training was different from real shooting. Her shot went wide, missing Blackwood but hitting the horse of the man beside him. The animal screamed and reared, throwing its rider. Then the yard exploded into gunfire. Blackwood fired at Abigail. She felt something burn past her ear, so close she heard the bullets whistle. Her horse danced sideways, but she held on, fired again. This time she aimed for his horse, not the man. Couldn't bring herself to aim at a person, even him. The shot hit the animal's flank, not fatal, but enough to make it bolt. Blackwood fought for control, his return fire going wild. Boaz reached the yard and threw himself from his horse, using it as cover. He brought his rifle up, aimed at Blackwood, and couldn't pull the trigger. Abigail saw it, saw him freeze, saw the rifle waver. 20 years of nightmares, of guilt, of a dying boy's face, all crashing down on him at once. One of Blackwood's men saw it too, saw the hesitation, swung his rifle toward Boaz's unprotected back. "Boaz!" Abigail screamed. She didn't think, just aimed and fired. The shot took the hired gun in the shoulder, spinning him around. He fell, cursing, his rifle clattering away. Abigail stared at her pistol, shocked. She'd shot a man, actually shot him. The moment of frozen horror almost cost her everything. Another of Blackwood's men was drawing a bead on her when Dutch's rifle cracked. The man went down, clutching his leg. "Get to cover," Dutch shouted at her. Abigail finally moved, diving from her horse and scrambling behind the water trough. Bullets kicked up dirt around her, but she made it, pressed her back against the wood, breathing hard, pistol clutched in shaking hands. Across the yard, Boaz was still frozen. Still couldn't shoot. Even with men trying to kill him, that dead boy's face wouldn't let him pull the trigger. Then he heard it. Hoofbeats. More riders coming. For a terrible moment, Abigail thought it was reinforcements for Blackwood, but then she saw who was riding hard toward the ranch. Dr. Morrison, Reverend Matthews, Thomas Henderson, and the other men from town. 8 of them, armed and grim-faced. They must have seen the smoke from town, heard the gunfire, and come early. "Hold fire!" Reverend Matthews' voice carried across the yard. "Marcus Blackwood, you're surrounded. Stand down." For a moment, everything stopped. Blackwood, still fighting his panicked horse, looked around at the men ringing the yard. His hired guns, 2 down and wounded, the others suddenly realizing they were outnumbered. "You can't prove anything," Blackwood shouted. "This is my word against theirs." "We have your ledger," Dr. Morrison called back. "We've read every word, every bribe, every murder. It's over, Marcus." Blackwood's face went from rage to calculation. Abigail could see him thinking, weighing options. Then his expression hardened into something desperate and dangerous. "If I'm going down," he said, "I'm taking him with me." He swung his pistol toward Boaz, and Abigail shot him. Not to kill, even then, even in that moment, she couldn't bring herself to aim for his heart. But she hit his gun hand, the pistol flying from his grip. Blackwood howled, clutching his bleeding hand. His horse, finally breaking from his control, bolted. He hit the ground hard, rolled, came up with a knife in his left hand. He was running at Boaz before anyone could react. Boaz saw him coming, raised his rifle, put Blackwood's chest in the sights, and still couldn't pull the trigger. "I'm sorry," Blackwood snarled as he closed the distance. "I'm sorry your father had to die. But this land was mine." Abigail was moving before she knew it. Running from cover, empty pistol in hand, she wouldn't make it in time. Blackwood was too close, Boaz too frozen. But then Boaz did something nobody expected. He dropped his rifle, stepped forward, and caught Blackwood's knife hand in one massive fist. "You're right," Boaz said quietly. "My father bought land your father lost, and that shame killed your father, broke your mother's heart, destroyed your childhood. That's a terrible thing, a tragedy." Blackwood struggled, but Boaz's grip was iron. "But my father didn't do that to you," Boaz continued. "Your father did, with his gambling, his pride, his weakness. And you've spent 40 years making everyone else pay for what he did to you." He squeezed, and Blackwood gasped in pain. The knife fell from his fingers. "I could kill you now," Boaz said. "Snap your arm, break your neck. I'm strong enough. God knows you deserve it." Everyone in the yard held their breath. "But I'm not going to," Boaz said, "because I'm not you. I'm not my father. I'm not anyone's ghost. I'm just a man trying to live without adding more blood to the ground." He released Blackwood and stepped back. "You're going to jail, Marcus. You're going to hang for murder, but it won't be by my hand." Blackwood stared at him, disbelieving. Then he lunged, not with the knife, but with his bare hands, going for Boaz's throat. Boaz caught him easily, held him at arm's length like a child having a tantrum, and in that moment Abigail saw the truth. Boaz wasn't weak. His refusal to kill wasn't cowardice. It was the strongest thing he could have done. Dr. Morrison and the others moved in then, subduing Blackwood and his wounded men, binding them with rope. It was over. Boaz turned to look for Abigail, found her standing 10 feet away, pistol still in her hand, staring at him. "You shot him," he said, "to save me." "I couldn't let him hurt you." "You killed—" He stopped, corrected himself. "You shot a man. For me. I'd do it again." They stood there in the aftermath, smoke still hanging in the air, wounded men groaning, horses stamping nervously. And something passed between them that was deeper than words. She'd been willing to kill for him. He'd chosen mercy, even in the face of death. And somehow, both choices were right. Dutch paused, his voice thick with emotion. "That's when I knew," he said. They weren't just married anymore. They were truly bonded. She'd seen his weakness and still chose him. He'd seen her strength and wasn't threatened by it. That's rare, real rare. "What happened to Blackwood?" Samuel asked. "Patience," Dutch said. "I'm getting there." They took Blackwood and his men to town, bound and defeated. The whole community turned out to watch the procession. Some jeered. Others just stared in silence at the man who'd terrorized Red Fern Ridge for so long. The territorial marshal arrived 3 days later. By then, every person in town had heard about the ledger, about the confession, about the 20 years of crimes. The trial was quick. The evidence overwhelming. Marcus Blackwood was found guilty of murder, fraud, and a dozen other charges. They hanged him on a gray December morning. Abigail didn't attend, couldn't bear to watch any man die, even him. But Boaz went, felt he owed it to his father's memory to see justice done. When he came home afterward, he found Abigail in the garden beds he'd built, even though it was winter and nothing could grow. She was just sitting there, wrapped in a coat, staring at the frozen earth. "It's done," he said quietly. "How do you feel?" "Empty. Not satisfied. Not happy. Just empty." He sat beside her on the cold ground. "I thought it would feel different, knowing he'd paid for what he did. But it doesn't bring Pa back. Doesn't undo 20 years. "No," Abigail agreed. "It doesn't." They sat in silence for a while. Then Boaz said, "I couldn't shoot him. Even when he was trying to kill me. I just couldn't." "I know. Does that make me weak?" Abigail turned to look at him. "You're the strongest man I've ever known. You broke a cycle of violence that's probably been going on in this territory since the first settlers arrived. You chose mercy when revenge would have been easier. That's not weakness, Boaz. That's courage I can barely comprehend. But you had to shoot for me, had to do what I couldn't. And you held Blackwood without killing him, gave him to the law instead of becoming his executioner. We each did what the other couldn't. That's what partners do." He reached for her hand, found it cold from the winter air, warmed it between his palms. "I love you," he said. It was the first time either of them had said it. Abigail felt tears spring to her eyes. "I love you too. I think I have for weeks now. Maybe from the moment you showed me your mother's watch. Maybe before." "When did this happen?" he asked, wonder in his voice. "When did we stop being a practical arrangement and become this?" "I don't know. Somewhere between the contract and the gunfight. Somewhere in all the quiet moments in between." He pulled her close and she leaned into his warmth. They sat like that in the frozen garden until the sun went down. Two people who'd found each other in the strangest way possible and become something neither had expected. Something real, something lasting, something worth fighting for. Dutch smiled through the tears on his weathered face. "That's the moment right there," he said. "That's when they became what you know, your grandparents. The couple everyone in 3 counties talked about, the school teacher and the gentle giant who loved each other like the prairie loves the rain." "But what happened after?" the bride asked. "How did they live?" "Like anyone lives," Dutch said, "one day at a time, learning each other, building something together." Winter passed into spring. The snow melted, revealing the prairie grass beneath, brown and dormant but ready to grow. Abigail continued teaching, though now she rode to school on a better horse, a wedding gift Boaz had been saving to give her at the right time. Her students noticed a change in her. She was still kind, still patient, but there was a steel underneath now, a certainty that came from knowing she could face down armed men and survive. Sarah Mitchell asked her one day, Mrs. Cutter, are you still going to teach when the baby comes?" Abigail had been grading papers. She looked up, surprised. "How did you know?" "You keep touching your stomach when you think nobody's looking, and you smile when you do it." Smart girl, going to be a teacher herself someday, Abigail thought. "I'll teach as long as I can," she said, "and after the baby comes, we'll see. But yes, Sarah, I'll always be a teacher. It's who I am." "Good," Sarah said simply, "because you're the best teacher I've ever had." That evening, Abigail told Boaz officially, though he'd already guessed, the same way Sarah had, by watching her, learning her tells, knowing her. "A baby," he said, touching her stomach with gentle reverence. "Our baby." "Are you happy?" "Terrified," he admitted. "But yes, so happy I can barely breathe." They started preparing the nursery that week. Dutch helped Boaz build a cradle from oak, not from the north pasture, but from trees on the eastern section of the ranch. New wood for a new life. "What about names?" Boaz asked one evening as they worked. "I have one in mind," Abigail said. "If it's a boy, if you agree." "What is it?" "Samuel, after your father." Boaz's hand stilled on the wood. "You'd do that? Name our son after him? He was a good man who died too soon. Our son should carry that legacy, should know where he comes from, and what kind of man his grandfather was. Boaz set down his tools and pulled her close. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you for understanding what that means." "Family," Abigail said simply. "That's what it means. And we're building one together." The baby came in late summer, on a hot August day when the prairie shimmered with heat. Dr. Morrison delivered him, with Dutch and Boaz pacing outside like expectant fathers have done since the beginning of time. When Morrison finally emerged, he was grinning. "You have a son, big as his father, strong lungs, and your wife is asking for you." Boaz practically ran into the bedroom, found Abigail exhausted but radiant, holding a bundle that seemed impossibly small in her arms. "Meet Samuel," she said. "Samuel Cutter." Boaz took his son with shaking hands. The baby was red-faced and squalling, fists waving at the injustice of being born. But he was perfect, absolutely perfect. "He's going to be tall," Boaz said, awed. "He's going to be like his father," Abigail replied. "Strong and gentle and good." Dutch came in then, uninvited but welcome, looked at the baby and let tears run down his weathered face. "He's got Michael's eyes," he said. "Your father would have been so proud, boy." Boaz pulled out the pocket watch, opened it to show the photograph of his parents. "This is yours now, Samuel," he said to the baby, who couldn't possibly understand. "Your grandfather's watch. Someday I'll tell you about him, about the man you're named for, and about the land he loved and the promises we make to those we've lost. But more importantly," Abigail added, "we'll tell you about the promises we make to the living, about choosing love over hate, mercy over revenge, life over death." The baby, perhaps sensing the gravity of the moment, had stopped crying. He looked up at his parents with unfocused eyes, and Boaz could have sworn he smiled. "Welcome to the world, son," Boaz whispered. "We've been waiting for you." Dutch paused in his telling, wiping his eyes openly now. "That's me," Samuel said quietly. "I'm that baby." "Yes, you are," Dutch confirmed. "And that watch you're carrying, the one your father gave you when you turned 20, that's the same one. 4 generations now. Michael's watch, Boaz's watch, your father's watch, yours." Samuel pulled out the watch, looked at it with new understanding. "Why didn't they ever tell me the full story?" he asked. "About Blackwood? About the gunfight?" "Because they didn't want you growing up in the shadow of violence," Dutch said. "They wanted you to know you came from love, not from fear or revenge. That's why they told the simple version. Practical arrangement became love. True enough, far as it goes. But not the whole truth. No, the whole truth has teeth, like I said at the start." Dutch leaned forward. "But you're a man now, about to start your own family. You deserve to know the real story, to understand what kind of people you come from. The years that followed were good ones. Not perfect. No life is perfect. There were hard winters and dry summers. Cattle died. Crops failed. Money was tight sometimes. But through it all, Abigail and Boaz had each other. She taught for 10 more years, until 3 more children, 2 daughters and another son, made it impossible to do both jobs well, but she never stopped being a teacher. Just changed her classroom from the schoolhouse to her kitchen table. Boaz ran the ranch with Dutch's help and later with Samuel's. The North Pasture remained part of the Cutter holdings, but Boaz never treated it as sacred ground anymore. It was just land. Good grazing land. Nothing more, nothing less. He never fired a weapon again after that day. Kept the rifles, maintained them carefully, but never used them. And nobody in the family ever asked him to. They grew old together, Abigail and Boaz. Grew gray together. Grew comfortable together in the way only people who've survived storms together can. Reverend Matthews married them again on their 10th anniversary. Not legally, they were already married. But in front of the whole community, they renewed the vows they'd once made so practically. This time Boaz said, "I love you," in front of everyone. And Abigail cried happy tears and said it back. Dutch, watching from the front pew, remembered that first wedding. How uncertain they'd both been. How carefully they'd avoided any mention of love. 10 years. It had taken 10 years for them to get back to this moment, but they'd arrived. Together. Dutch stood slowly from his chair, every joint protesting, went to the small shelf where he kept his most precious possings. He brought back a wooden box, worn smooth from handling. "Your grandmother made me promise," he said to Samuel, "before she passed last year, made me promise to give you this when you got married." He opened the box. Inside were papers. The marriage contract, yellowed with age, the forged deed that had nearly cost them everything, and letters, so many letters. "What are these?" Samuel asked. "Love letters. Your grandfather wrote to your grandmother every day for 40 years. Even when she was just in the next room, he'd write down his thoughts, his feelings, things he had trouble saying out loud. And she'd write back. They'd leave the letters for each other around the house like treasure hunts." Dutch pulled out one letter, unfolded it carefully. "This is from the night before the confrontation with Blackwood. Your grandfather wrote it thinking he might die. Listen." He read aloud in the firelight. "Abigail, if you're reading this, I didn't make it through tomorrow. I'm sorry. Sorry for bringing you into this danger. Sorry for being too weak to pull the trigger when it mattered. Sorry for so many things, but I'm not sorry I married you. That's the one thing I'll never be sorry for. You asked me once when I knew I loved you. I've been thinking about that. I think it was the first night you sat with me after a nightmare. You didn't try to fix me, didn't tell me it would be okay. You just sat there in the dark, keeping me company. That's when I knew. You see my brokenness, and you don't look away. That's a gift I never thought I'd have. If I don't survive tomorrow, please know this. You made me believe in futures again, in possibilities, in the idea that broken things can still grow. Whatever happens, you were the best thing that ever happened to me, the most unexpected, impractical, perfect thing. With all my love, Boaz." Dutch's voice broke on the last line. He carefully refolded the letter and handed it to Samuel. "He lived another 43 years after writing that," Dutch said. "Died in his sleep at 81, your grandmother lying next to him. They went within 6 months of each other like they couldn't bear to be apart, even in death." Samuel held the letter like it was made of glass. "I never knew." "Of course you didn't. They were private people, didn't need the whole world knowing their business. But they wanted you to know, eventually. When you were starting your own marriage." Dutch looked at the bride. "Both of you need to understand something. Marriage isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about finding someone you can survive the imperfect with." "Is that what they had?" the bride asked. "That and more. They had partnership, real partnership. She was willing to kill for him. He was willing to die rather than become a killer. And somehow, both of those things were right. Both of those things were love." Dutch gathered up the letters, put them back in the box, and handed it to Samuel. "These are yours now. Read them together, you and your wife. Learn from them. Your grandparents weren't saints. They were just two people who chose each other every day, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard." They sat around the fire for a long time after that, Dutch telling smaller stories. About Abigail teaching Samuel to read, about Boaz teaching his son to ride, about quiet Sunday dinners and loud Christmas gatherings and all the ordinary moments that made up a life. Finally, as midnight approached, Samuel and his bride prepared to leave. "Thank you," Samuel said, "for telling us the real story." "Thank you for listening," Dutch replied. "Stories need to be heard to stay alive, and this one deserves to live." As they reached the door, the bride turned back. "Dutch, what's the most important thing they taught you? About love, I mean." The old cowboy thought about that for a long moment. "That it's a choice," he said finally. "Every day it's a choice. Your grandfather could have chosen bitterness after his father died. Your grandmother could have chosen safety over risk. They could have chosen to see their practical arrangement as just that, practical, but they didn't. They chose each other. Chose to build something real out of something that started as necessity." He smiled, his weathered face creasing into 1,000 lines. "Love isn't lightning that strikes you down," he said. "It's rain. Slow, steady, soaking deep. And when it grows something, that something lasts." After they left, Dutch stood at his window, watching their horses disappear into the night. The moon was full, painting the prairie in silver, and he could just make out the north pasture in the distance. So much had happened there. Death and life. Endings and beginnings. The ground where Michael Cutter died, and where Boaz Cutter learned to live again. Dutch pulled out the pocket watch one more time. Looked at the young couple in the photograph. "I kept my promise, Michael," he said softly. "Looked after your boy, saw him through the worst of it. And Abigail? She saved him in ways I never could." He closed the watch. Tomorrow he'd give it to Samuel properly. It had been waiting in his keeping since Boaz died, waiting for the right moment. But tonight, it was still his to hold. One last night with the weight of all those years in his palm. Dutch thought about the story he'd just told. The real story, with all its teeth and blood and beauty. He'd left some things out, small things, private things, that belonged only to Abigail and Boaz. But he'd told the truth that mattered, about choosing partnership over pride, about mercy being stronger than revenge, about two people who started as strangers and became the kind of love that changed everyone who witnessed it. The fire burned down to coals. Dutch didn't rebuild it, just sat in the darkness, remembering. Remembering the school teacher who became a warrior, the warrior who chose peace, the practical arrangement that became a frontier legend, remembering his family, because that's what they'd been, really. Boaz was more son than employer, Abigail more daughter. Samuel and his siblings, the grandchildren Dutch never had, they'd given him that, included him in their circle of love, never made him feel like just the hired hand, and now his job was almost done. One more task to complete. The next morning dawned clear and cold. Dutch woke stiff and sore. He'd slept in his chair by the dead fire, too caught up in memories to make it to bed. He made coffee, ate a simple breakfast, then dressed in his best clothes, the ones he wore to church and funerals and other important occasions. He saddled his horse, an old mare as weathered as he was, and rode slowly toward the main ranch house where Samuel and his bride were staying. They were at breakfast when he arrived. Abigail's house, though she'd been gone a year, it still felt like her house, full of her touches and her warmth. "Dutch," Samuel said, surprised. "I wasn't expecting you. Everything all right?" "Fine, boy, but I've got something for you, something I've been holding on to." He pulled out the pocket watch and set it on the table between them. "Your grandfather gave this to me the day before he died," Dutch said. "Made me promise to give it to you when you were ready, when you understood what it meant." Samuel picked up the watch carefully, opened it. The photograph was still there, his great-grandparents, young and serious, staring out from the past. "I'm ready," Samuel said. "I know you are. Telling you that story, that was the last part of getting you ready. Now you know where you come from, what kind of people made you, what kind of love you're carrying forward." The bride leaned over to look at the photograph. They looked so stern. "Photography was serious business back then," Dutch said, "but I knew them when they smiled. Your grandfather had a smile that could light up a whole room, and your grandmother, she had a laugh like music, pure and joyful and free." He stood to leave, but Samuel stopped him. "Stay for breakfast, Dutch, please." So Dutch stayed, ate scrambled eggs and bacon and fresh bread, listening to the young couple talk about their plans for the ranch, for their life together. It felt right sitting at this table. Full circle somehow. He'd sat at this table with Michael Cutter 50 years ago, with Boaz and Abigail for 40 years after that. And now, with the next generation, the land endured, the family endured, the love endured. That was what mattered. Dutch lived another 5 years after that night of storytelling. Long enough to see Samuel's first child born, a daughter they named Abigail, after her great-grandmother. Long enough to hold that baby and see the chain continuing. Another generation carrying forward the legacy of the schoolteacher and the gentle giant who'd loved each other against all odds. He died peacefully in his sleep one winter night, the same way Boaz had. Just slipped away between one breath and the next, ready to rejoin the family he'd served and loved for 60 years. They buried him in the small cemetery on the ranch, next to Michael and Catherine Cutter, next to Boaz and Abigail. Dutch had no family of his own, but the Cutters claimed him. Put his name on a stone that read, Dutch Kellerman, 1830 to 1907, faithful friend, beloved family. At the funeral, Samuel stood with his own son now, young Michael, named for his great-great-grandfather, and told the story. Not the simple version, the real one, the one Dutch had entrusted to him, about the practical arrangement, about the forged deed and the confrontation, about courage and mercy and love that grew like rain. And as he talked, he realized something. The story wasn't just about Boaz and Abigail, it was about everyone who chose partnership over pride, who chose to build rather than destroy, who chose love even when, especially when, it was hard. That was the legacy, not the land, though the land remained, not the pocket watch, though it would be passed down for generations more. The legacy was the choice, the daily choice to stand together, to see each other's brokenness and not look away. To be brave and foolish all at once. That was what Dutch had been trying to teach him, what Boaz and Abigail had lived, and what Samuel would carry forward with his own bride, his own children, his own quiet days of building something that would last. The cabin stands empty now, Dutch's cabin, though everyone still calls it that, even though he's been gone nearly 100 years. It's maintained by the Cutter family, restored, preserved, made into a small museum of sorts. Inside are artifacts from the old days, the marriage contract framed on the wall, photographs of Boaz and Abigail, young and old, the pocket watch under glass, and in a box, carefully preserved, all those letters. 40 years of love written down, one day at a time. Tourists come sometimes. History buffs interested in frontier life. Students writing papers about women in the West. Families tracing their genealogy. They read the plaques, look at the photographs, marvel at how hard life must have been back then, but they don't really understand, can't really comprehend what it meant to stand in a ranch yard facing down armed men, or to choose mercy when revenge would have been easier, or to build a marriage out of nothing but respect and need and the slow accumulation of ordinary days. That understanding belongs to the family, passed down through stories told by firelight, through pocket watches and old letters and the way great-grandparents are spoken of with reverence and love. Samuel's great-great-grandson lives on the ranch now, works the same land Boaz worked, grazes cattle in the north pasture where so much blood was spilled and so much was redeemed. He married his high school sweetheart in a practical ceremony, nothing fancy, just friends and family. And on their first anniversary, his grandmother pulled him aside and gave him a wooden box. "Read these," she said, "when you're fighting, when you think you can't make it work. Read these and remember what real love looks like." Inside were the letters, Boaz and Abigail, writing to each other across 4 decades. Some were passionate, some were mundane, shopping lists and reminders and comments about the weather. Some were profound, but all of them, every single one, ended the same way. Choosing you today, choosing you tomorrow, choosing you always. That was the secret. Not lightning, not destiny, not fate. Choice. Daily, deliberate, determined choice. The young man read the letters with his wife, learned about his great-great-great-grandparents, about the school teacher who became a warrior, about the giant who chose gentleness, about the partnership that became legend. And when his own first child was born, another Samuel, because some names are too important to let die, he pulled out the pocket watch and opened it carefully. The photograph was faded now, the faces barely visible. But he could still make out 2 people standing side by side, formal and unsmiling for the camera. But he knew the truth behind that stern photograph, knew the laughter and the tears and the love that had filled the years after it was taken. "This is yours someday," he told his infant son. Your great-great-great-great-grandfather's swatch. It's been handed down for 5 generations now, and with it comes a story. The baby couldn't understand, of course. Wouldn't understand for years yet, but someday he would. Someday he'd sit by a fire and hear about Abigail and Boaz, about Dutch and the North Pasture and the winter when everything changed. Someday he'd learn that love isn't lightning, it's rain, slow, steady, soaking deep. And when it grows something, that something lasts. Outside the ranch house, the prairie stretches endlessly in all directions. The same prairie Abigail looked at when she first arrived, lonely and afraid. The same prairie Boaz rode across with his father's pocket watch in his vest and a dead boy's face in his nightmares. The grass grows gold in September, just like it did 140 years ago. The wind still blows from the north, carrying the scent of winter. And in the small cemetery on the hill, 5 generations of Cutters rest beside the man who became their family without sharing their blood. Their stones are simple, just names and dates, no flowery epitaphs. But on Abigail and Boaz's shared stone, someone carved a line from Tennyson. The poem they'd both loved, "Come, my friends, 'tis not too late to seek a newer world." They'd found their new world together, built it from nothing but necessity and respect, and the slow accumulation of ordinary moments that became extraordinary. That's the story, the real story. Not about destiny or fate or lightning strikes of passion, but about 2 people who chose each other, who stood together when the world tried to tear them apart, who learned that the deepest love grows quietly, like grass after rain, and about the legacy they left behind, not just in the land or the watch or the letters, but in every person who heard their story and learned that love is a choice, every day a choice. To see another's brokenness and not look away. To stand together when standing apart would be easier. To build something lasting in a world that tries to tear everything down. That's the lesson Abigail and Boaz left behind. That's the gift they gave to every generation that followed. And that's why, on cold winter nights when the wind howls across the prairie, you can still hear Dutch's voice in the cabin by the North Pasture. Still hear him telling the story of the schoolteacher and the gentle giant. The practical arrangement that became a frontier legend. The rain that grew something lasting. The love that chose every day to begin again. "Is he all right?" Samuel asked, worried. "He's wonderful, happy, at peace." Abigail smiled. "We both are. After all these years, we've learned that peace isn't the absence of struggle. It's knowing you're strong enough to face whatever comes. Together." She looked at Samuel and his bride. "That's what I want you to understand about your grandparents' story. It wasn't a fairy tale. It was 2 broken people choosing to heal together, 2 scared people choosing to be brave together, 2 lonely people choosing to build a family together." "Did you ever regret it?" the bride asked. "The practical arrangement? Not having a romantic courtship?" Abigail laughed. "Child, I had romance back in Ohio. I had pretty words and flowers and a man who promised me everything. And he left me the moment his father disapproved. Your grandfather never promised me romance. He promised me partnership, respect, honesty, and he delivered on every promise for 40 years. She stood, moved to the window. Outside the snow had stopped. Stars were visible now, brilliant in the clear cold. "Romance fades," she said quietly. "Passion cools, but partnership, respect, choosing each other every day, that lasts. That's what sustained us through cattle plagues and droughts and hard winters, through losing friends and raising children and growing old." She turned back to them. "We didn't start with love, we started with a contract, but we built love. Day by day, choice by choice, we built something that's lasted 4 decades, and it's still growing." Dutch cleared his throat. "There's one more thing they need to know." Abigail raised an eyebrow. "Oh?" "About the North Pasture." "Ah, yes." Abigail sat down again. 5 years ago, a railroad company approached us, wanted to buy the North Pasture, offered 3 times what it's worth, would have set us up for life, financially speaking. "What did you do?" Samuel asked. "We said no." She said it simply. "Because that land isn't just property. It's where your great-grandfather died, where your grandfather made a promise, where our story really began. Some things aren't for sale, no matter the price." But, she continued, we did do something different. We opened it up. Let the town use it for gatherings. Let people picnic there. Let children play there. Let it be a place of life instead of a shrine to death. Your grandfather's idea, Dutch added, said his father would rather have that land filled with laughter than guarded like a tomb. That's what this story is really about, Abigail said. Not about fighting off villains or protecting property. It's about learning when to hold on and when to let go, when to honor the past and when to embrace the future. She looked at her grandson. Samuel, you're starting your own marriage now, your own life. You'll face your own battles, make your own choices. But remember this, love isn't something that happens to you. It's something you build, day by day, choice by choice. It's work and patience and forgiveness and showing up even when it's hard. Is that what Grandpa taught you? Samuel asked. No, Abigail smiled. That's what we taught each other. Dutch stood, stretched his old bones. It's late. Storm's past. You should head home before it starts up again. Samuel and his bride rose reluctantly, clearly wanting to hear more. But they also understood. Some stories had natural endings, and this one had been told. As they bundled into coats and gloves, the bride turned to Abigail. Thank you for sharing the real story, not the sanitized church version. The real story is always better, Abigail said. Messier, more complicated, but better. Samuel hugged his grandmother, then Dutch. Will you both be all right? The storm... We're both tougher than we look, Dutch said. Now go, before your young bride freezes. They watched from the doorway as Samuel and his bride rode away into the star-bright night. When they were gone, Abigail turned to Dutch. You told it well. I told it true. Same thing in your case, she smiled. Boaz will want to know you've been gossiping about him. Let him complain. I'm too old to care. Dutch moved back to his chair. Stay for coffee, or do you need to get back? Coffee sounds perfect. She settled into the chair Samuel had vacated. It's strange hearing our story told like that, like something that happened to other people. It did happen to other people. You're not the same woman who signed that contract 40 years ago. No, I'm not. Abigail was quiet for a moment. Do you think we did right? By Samuel and Lily? Teaching them our way of doing things? I think you raised two strong, good people who know how to love well. What more can parents do? Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if Boaz hadn't come to that schoolhouse, if he'd chosen differently, if I'd said no. But he did, and you didn't, and that's the only story that matters. Dutch poured coffee for them both. Besides, I don't think either of you could have chosen different. You were meant for each other. Just took a while for the world to arrange the meeting. They sat in comfortable silence, drinking coffee, watching the fire burn down. Finally, Abigail said, He asked me something yesterday, Boaz did. What's that? He asked if I was happy. After all these years, all the struggles, was I happy? What did you tell him? I told him the truth. Her eyes were soft with memory. I told him, I'm happier than I ever imagined possible, that the practical arrangement we started with turned into the greatest love story of my life, that I'd choose him again. Every single day, I'd choose him again. And what did he say? Abigail smiled. He said, yeah, good, because you're stuck with me now, Mrs. Cutter. Contract's binding. Dutch laughed. That sounds like him. They finished their coffee as the fire died to embers. Then Abigail stood, pulled on her coat. Walk you home? Dutch offered. I remember the way, but her voice was warm. Thank you, Dutch, for being part of our story, for being family. Couldn't have stayed away if I'd tried. You Cutters are stubborn about keeping people. At the door she paused. Do you think they understood, Samuel and his bride, what we were trying to tell them? They understood enough. The rest they'll learn by living it. She nodded, stepped out into the cold, clear night. Dutch watched from his doorway as she walked across the snow toward the main house. Lights glowed in the windows there, warm and welcoming. Through one window, he could see Boaz's silhouette. The old man was standing waiting for his wife to come home. After 40 years, still waiting, still choosing her, still choosing love. Dutch closed his door and moved back to his chair. He picked up the photograph he kept on the mantel, not the pocket watch, but a different picture, taken 10 years ago, the whole family. Boaz and Abigail, older but still strong. Samuel and Lily, grown and married themselves, grandchildren. A whole legacy spread out in one image. "We did all right, Michael," he said to the ghost of his old friend. "Your boy did all right. Found himself a woman worth fighting for, built a life worth living." He set the picture down, banked the fire for the night. Outside, the prairie stretched away to forever, cold and harsh and beautiful. The land that had shaped them all, the land that would outlast them all. But for now, for tonight, the Cutter family was home, safe, together. And that was enough. That was everything. The last story Dutch told was in the spring of 1903, when he was 85 years old, by his own finally honest count. He'd been failing all winter. Everyone could see it, moving slower, sleeping more, eating less, but he'd held on, stubborn to the last. One warm afternoon in May, he asked Boaz and Abigail to come to his cabin. They came immediately, bringing Samuel and Lily with them. Dutch was in his chair by the window, a blanket over his knees despite the warm day, but his eyes were bright. "Wanted to talk to you all," he said, "while I still can." "Dutch," Boaz started. "Hush, I'm dying. We all know it. No point dancing around it." He looked at each of them in turn. "I've had a good life, better than I deserved. Got to watch you two fall in love. Got to help raise these babies. Got to be part of something bigger than myself." "Your family," Abigail said, her voice thick. "You've always been family." "I know. That's why this is easy." He smiled. "I'm not scared, not sad. I'm grateful for all of it, even the hard parts. Especially the hard parts, maybe. They're what made the good parts so sweet." He looked at Boaz. "Your father would be so proud of you, the man you became, the family you built, the way you chose mercy over vengeance. He's proud. I know he is." Boaz was crying openly. "I couldn't have done any of it without you, Dutch. You and Abigail, you saved me. You saved yourself, boy. We just stood witness." Dutch turned to Abigail. "You were the best thing that ever happened to this family. The catalyst, the bridge, the heart. Never forget that." "I won't," she whispered. He looked at Samuel and Lily. "You too. You carry the legacy forward, not just the land, the love, the choosing, the standing together when it's hard. You hear me?" They nodded, unable to speak. "Good." Dutch settled back in his chair. "Now, I've got one last request." "Anything," Boaz said. "Bury me in the North Pasture, near your father. I've been watching over that land for 60 years. Might as well keep doing it permanent-like." "Dutch, it's not sad. It's right." His eyes were closing now, tired. "That land is where your story really started, where the old pain ended and the new life began. Seems fitting I should rest there too." They sat with him as the afternoon faded to evening. He drifted in and out of consciousness, sometimes lucid, sometimes confused, but peaceful, always peaceful. Just before midnight, he opened his eyes one last time. "Abigail," he said clearly, "tell Samuel, young Samuel, I mean. Tell him the stories, all of them. Don't let him forget where he came from. Don't let any of them forget." "I promise," she said. "Good." He smiled. "That's good." He closed his eyes and didn't open them again. They buried Dutch Kellerman on a warm May morning in the North Pasture next to Michael Cutter's grave. Half the county came. He'd touched that many lives. Reverend Matthew's replacement, a young man new to Redfern Ridge, spoke about faith and rest and rewards in heaven, but it was Boaz who gave the real eulogy. "Dutch Kellerman was family," he said simply. "Not by blood, by choice. He chose to stay with us, chose to love us, chose to be part of our story, and we're better for it, all of us." He paused, looking at the grave. "This pasture has seen a lot of pain. My father died here. Blackwood tried to take it here. But today, we're choosing something different. We're choosing to remember joy, to honor the man who taught us what family really means." He placed a hand on the simple wooden marker they'd erected. "Rest well, old friend. We'll take it from here." In Dutch's cabin, Abigail finished her story. The fire had burned down to embers. Outside, the stars were fading as dawn approached. "That's the end," she said. "The real ending. Dutch is gone. Your grandfather and I are old. But the story continues. In you, in your children someday, in every choice you make to love well." Samuel was quiet for a long moment. Then, Thank you for telling us the truth, all of it. You're welcome. Abigail stood, wincing slightly at the stiffness in her joints. Now, I should get back. Your grandfather will worry. I'll walk you, Samuel offered. They stepped out into the pre-dawn cold. The snow had stopped entirely. The world was silent and pristine. As they walked, Samuel said, Grandma, can I ask you something? Of course. Do you think Grandpa and Dutch and your father, do you think they're together? Somewhere? Abigail looked up at the fading stars. I don't know. Maybe. I like to think so. Like to think they're all sitting around some celestial campfire, trading stories and watching over us. What about you? When it's your time? Then I'll join them. And your grandmother will finally get to meet the man who saved her grandson's life by teaching him what real love looks like. They reached the main house. Through the window, they could see Boaz in his chair, dozing by the fire but stirring as they approached, still waiting, always waiting. He loves you so much, Samuel said. Anyone can see it. And I love him. After 40 years, I love him more than I did when we started, because now I know him, all of him, the wounded parts and the strong parts and the gentle parts, and he knows me the same way. She hugged her grandson. That's what I want for you and your bride. Not perfect love, real love, the kind that grows deeper every year because you keep choosing it. We will, Samuel promised. We'll try. That's all anyone can do, try, and keep trying. She went inside, and Samuel watched through the window as his grandfather woke fully, saw his wife, smiled that smile that said everything without words, watched as Abigail crossed to him, as he stood and pulled her close, watched as two old people held each other in the lamplight, still grateful for one more day together. Samuel rode home to his own bride as the sun was rising. The snow sparkled in the new light, turning the prairie into a field of diamonds. And he thought about contracts and choices, about practical arrangements that become great loves, about standing together when the world says, run, about his grandparents' legacy, written not in stone but in the way they loved each other, the way they still loved each other, every single day. Abigail Cutter stood in the North Pasture on a warm June afternoon in 1908. She was 78 years old now, moving slower but still strong, still present. Behind her stood the three graves, Michael Cutter, Dutch Kellerman, and the newest one, grass still fresh on the mound. Boaz had died peacefully in his sleep 6 months earlier. Just slipped away in the middle of the night, Abigail beside him, as she'd been for 45 years. His last words to her, best decision I ever made, coming to that schoolhouse, asking you. Her last words to him, best decision I ever made, saying yes. Now she stood at his grave with flowers in her hand, prairie wildflowers, purple asters, and black-eyed Susans, the same ones he'd given her on their wedding day. Still miss you, she said conversationally. Still wake up reaching for you. Silly at my age, but there it is. She placed the flowers on the grave. Samuel brought his second son by yesterday, named him Boaz, after you. He's big, just like you were. Going to be a gentle giant, I think. Has your eyes. The wind rustled through the grass. If she let herself, she could almost believe it was him, answering. I've been thinking about that contract we signed, that practical arrangement, and I realized something. She smiled. We fulfilled every single term. You gave me security, partnership, respect, children, and I gave you the same. But we also gave each other things that weren't in the contract, things we didn't know we needed. You gave me courage, purpose, a reason to fight. And I gave you, what? Permission to be gentle? Permission to heal? She was quiet for a moment. Or maybe we just gave each other love, in all its messy, complicated, beautiful forms. A meadowlark sang from a nearby fence post. The sun was warm on her face. And Abigail Cutter felt suddenly, completely at peace. I'll see you soon, she said to the three graves, to the men who'd shaped her life. Not quite yet. Got a few more grandchildren to meet, few more stories to tell, but soon. She turned and walked back toward the ranch house, moving slower now, but steady. In the distance, she could see Samuel working with the cattle, could see Lily's daughter, another Abigail, playing in the yard, could see the life they'd built continuing, growing, expanding into the future. The practical arrangement she'd agreed to 45 years ago had become all of this: a family, a legacy, a love that would outlast them all. She smiled, thinking about a young teacher signing a contract with a stranger, thinking about all the ways that choice had changed everything, thinking about how the best adventures start with a single step into the unknown, and how sometimes, just sometimes, the practical choice is also the brave one. Abigail Cutter reached her house and went inside. There was lunch to make, grandchildren to feed, stories to tell, life in all its ordinary, extraordinary glory. And that, she thought, was exactly how it should be. The fire's gone out now, the story's told, and if you've been listening close, you know what I've been trying to say all along. Love isn't something that happens to you like lightning or fate or destiny. Love is a choice you make every day, in small ways and big ways, when it's easy and especially when it's hard. Boaz and Abigail, they chose each other when they were strangers. Chose each other when Marcus Blackwood threatened everything. Chose each other through nightmares and birth pains and harsh winters and long summers. Chose each other for 45 years, and that's the real magic. Not that they fell in love, but that they kept choosing it. So, if you're listening to this story beside your own fire, with your own partner beside you, remember, you don't need perfect love. You need real love, the kind you build day by day. The kind that grows deeper because you keep choosing it. The kind that lasts not because it's easy, but because you make it matter. That's what Abigail and Boaz taught me. That's what I'm trying to teach you. Now go on, go choose love, and make it